My name is Clara Winston, and I was 27 the morning my sister put on a bridal gown to attend my wedding. She stood in front of the tall mirror in our Hamptons bridal suite, smoothing the crushed silk of a dress she had stolen from my locked Manhattan atelier. My mother stood right behind her, adjusting the train and quietly asking me not to make a scene. They expected me to crumble. I design high-end wedding dresses for a living, and they knew this was a direct strike at my career and my dignity. I poured a cup of espresso, and I did not say a single word. But here is what neither of my family members knew as they admired that stolen silk. Hidden deep inside the bodice lining was a registered tracking device, and waiting for us at the end of the aisle was a sitting federal judge briefed on a felony. What happened when my sister took her walk down that gravel runner is the reason I am telling you this story today. Welcome back to Luke Vengeance, where we tell true stories of quiet dignity and the precise moment someone stops shrinking to fit a family that never wanted them. If you have ever watched someone try to steal your light, drop your age in the comments below and be sure to subscribe. The trap began 2 weeks before we ever reached the coast. It started with the soft, electronic chime of a freight elevator. I sat in the center of my darkened studio holding a glass of ice water, watching the security footage from the night before play out on my monitor. On the screen, my mother Evelyn and my older sister Isabella were wrestling a heavy, matte black garment bag out of my locked workroom. They lacked the grace required to handle haute couture. Isabella yanked the zipper casing, her manicured nails catching on the protective fabric. Inside that bag was the Sovereign. It was a custom, hand-beaded masterpiece I had spent 8 months designing for a European royal client. It featured a cascading train and over 10,000 hand-sewn micro-pearls. The client had wired $150,000 to my corporate account just 3 days prior. Isabella lived her life governed by a single, desperate arithmetic. She had to be the prettiest woman in any room. If she was not the center of attention, the room had no value to her. We were heading into a Hamptons summer wedding. In that exclusive enclave of New York society, the financial and fashion elite enforced their hierarchy through whispered judgments and strict guest lists. Wearing white to a wedding is an insult. Wearing a bespoke bridal gown to your younger sister's wedding is a declaration of war. Growing up, my mother served as her dedicated defense attorney. Whenever my sister borrowed my design portfolios to pass off as her own taste or spilled red wine on my graduation dress, Evelyn deployed her practiced, gentle tone. "She's just impulsive. Clara, let her have this one." Evelyn treated my success as a communal closet. It was a resource meant to be harvested whenever her older daughter's fragile ego required padding. Watching the screen, I noted how my mother glanced nervously at the security camera above the door. She knew the lens was there. She simply believed her status as my mother granted her immunity from the consequences. A high-end bridal studio in Manhattan is a fortress. It requires biometric access and coded key fobs. How did Evelyn bypass my security? A month prior, she had guilt-tripped me into giving her a temporary vendor pass under the guise of dropping off floral samples for the reception. It was a premeditated breach. They thought they were taking a family favor. They believed they were just borrowing a pretty dress to ensure Isabella felt special at my wedding. What Evelyn and Isabella failed to understand was the modern reality of my industry. The Sovereign was not just silk and pearls. It was an internationally insured asset. I set my glass down on the mahogany desk. The condensation left a dark ring on the wood. A decade ago, I would have cried. I would have called Evelyn, begging for an explanation and negotiating my own boundaries just to keep the peace. I would have rushed to fix their mistake and protect their reputation. But at 27, I no longer operated on emotion. I ran a brand that dictated the aesthetic of the city's elite. I watched the elevator doors slide shut on the monitor, sealing my family inside with the stolen silk. I did not reach for my phone to call the precinct. That would be too swift and too simple. In New York society, you do not punish people by yelling at them. You punish them by pricing them. They were oblivious to the fact that they had just crossed the line from petty family entitlement to first-degree grand larceny. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the empty studio settle around me. For the first time in my life, I decided not to save them from themselves. I decided to let them keep the dress. I opened my laptop, typed in my corporate credentials, and watched a small red dot ping its exact location on a digital map. The dress was moving steadily toward Isabella's Upper East Side apartment. She was building her own guillotine, and she was entirely unaware of the digital leash she had wrapped around her own neck. My Manhattan atelier is not a boutique where casual shoppers browse through racks of tulle. It is a secure facility. The doors are reinforced glass. The entryways require a registered thumbprint and a rotating digital code. I built this space to protect designs that dictate the trends of the upcoming bridal seasons. My clients expect absolute discretion and uncompromised security. People do not just wander into my workroom. So the immediate question was how a mother and an older sister managed to bypass a system designed to repel corporate espionage. The answer was disappointingly simple. They weaponized my own lingering hope for a normal family. A month before the wedding, Evelyn came to my office. She brought 2 iced coffees and a folder full of floral arrangements. We sat on the velvet sofa in my reception area. She played the part of the devoted mother, helping her younger daughter plan the perfect Hamptons event. She talked about hydrangeas and seating charts. Then she sighed and mentioned how stressful the vendor deliveries were going to be on the week of the wedding. She offered to handle the florist drop-offs personally. She asked for a temporary vendor access card just to save me the headache of buzzing people in while I was doing fittings. I handed over the plastic card. I handed it over because part of me still wanted to believe my mother was genuinely trying to ease my burden. I ignored the instinct that told me Evelyn rarely offered favors without a hidden agenda. That small rectangular piece of plastic was the key they used to unlock the freight elevator and walk out with my most valuable creation. It was not a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated heist planned weeks in advance over iced coffee and fabric swatches. What Evelyn and Isabella failed to understand was the modern reality of haute couture. They thought they were stealing a very expensive piece of clothing. They did not realize they were stealing a tracked corporate asset. When you design a garment valued at $150,000, the insurance underwriters dictate the terms of your existence. My policies require strict chain of custody protocols. Sewn deep into the bodice lining of the sovereign, sitting quietly between the layers of French silk and the structural boning, is a micro radio frequency identification tag coupled with a localized tracking chip. It is the size of a dime. You cannot feel it from the outside. You cannot see it even if you turn the dress inside out. It is meant to protect the piece during international shipping to royal clients. As I sat in my quiet office, I did not dial emergency services. I opened my secure corporate portal. I typed in my credentials and watched a digital map of the city render on my screen. A small red dot pulsed brightly, confirming the status of my stolen property. I watched that dot travel up the avenues of Manhattan. It moved steadily in the back of what I assumed was a black car until it reached the Upper East Side. It stopped right at the address of Isabella's apartment building. I sat back and pictured the scene unfolding miles away. I imagined my sister unzipping the matte black bag and holding the crushed silk against her body in front of her bedroom mirror. I pictured Evelyn standing behind her, telling her how beautiful she looked, and reassuring her that I would eventually get over the shock. My sister was a woman who priced her own vanity far above my livelihood. I decided right then that I would not intervene. I would let her build her own snare. But as I watched the steady pulse of the red dot, a new problem emerged in my mind. It was a problem born of pure arithmetic and bodily dimensions. The sovereign was engineered for a specific human frame. The European royal who commissioned it is a former competitive equestrian. She stands 5 feet 11 inches tall. She possesses broad, athletic shoulders and a very narrow waist. Isabella is 5 feet 5 inches tall. She has a completely different skeletal structure. If Isabella simply put the gown on, it would swallow her. The bodice would sag, and the cascading train would drag awkwardly like a discarded parachute. Isabella could not just wear the dress. She had to alter it. The next morning, I returned to my desk early. I opened the tracking portal and waited. By 10 o'clock, the red dot woke up. It left the Upper East Side. It did not travel down to the Fashion District or to any of the reputable tailors on Fifth Avenue. High-end tailors ask questions. They recognize custom beadwork, and they demand provenance before they touch a needle to a six-figure garment. Instead, the dot moved across the bridge. It traveled deep into an outer borough. It stopped on a dense commercial street in Queens. I knew exactly what kind of businesses operated on that block. They were cash-only storefronts with sewing machines humming in the back rooms. Isabella was taking a masterpiece of modern design to a discount tailor who would not ask where the silk came from. This changed the entire landscape of the situation. I picked up my phone and made a call to the only person I trusted to handle the fallout. Victoria is my corporate attorney. She is a woman who moves through the legal circles of New York with the lethal grace of a shark navigating a glass tank. Victoria does not deal in family therapy or emotional apologies. She deals in contracts, liabilities, and asset recovery. We met for lunch at a quiet corner table in a restaurant near my studio. I laid my tablet on the white tablecloth and showed her the tracking data. I explained the dimensions of the dress and the location of the dot in Queens. Victoria took a slow sip of her sparkling water. She looked at the screen and then looked at me. She explained the law with terrifying clarity. Taking the dress out of the studio was grand larceny, but taking scissors to the fabric to alter the fit was the destruction of corporate property. The moment a needle pierced that silk, the dress could no longer be sold to the original client. The value drops to zero. She advised me not to stop them. She told me that every cut Isabella made and every seam she forced altered the crime. Isabella was actively manufacturing the very evidence that would bankrupt her. We began drafting our response right there over our salads. We did not write it as a pair of aggrieved family members. We prepared our strategy as a unified corporate entity handling a hostile asset extraction. Victoria smiled and closed her notebook. She told me to let Isabella wear the dress to the Hamptons, let her debut the stolen property in front of 200 of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state. We would let the audience serve as our witnesses. But there was one lingering issue. If Isabella or Evelyn suspected that I knew where the dress was, they might panic. They might abandon the garment in a dumpster or flee the venue before the ceremony began. To ensure they walked confidently into the trap, they needed to believe I was utterly destroyed. They needed to believe I was running out of time and desperate. I realized I had to perform the role they expected of me. I had to become the frantic younger sister sobbing over a ruined wedding. I needed to feed them a lie so perfect that they would never look over their shoulders. I paid the bill for lunch and headed back to my studio, ready to set the bait. I was going to leave a trail of breadcrumbs designed to make my sister feel invincible. To catch a predator, you do not build a stronger cage. You offer a wounded bird. My mother and sister were not criminal masterminds. They were opportunistic narcissists. If I went quiet after the theft, they would grow suspicious. If I acted unbothered by the disappearance of my most expensive creation, Evelyn would immediately sense a shift in the atmosphere. She had spent her entire adult life managing my emotional responses to Isabella's tantrums. She knew exactly how I was supposed to act when my older sibling took something that belonged to me. I was supposed to fold. I was supposed to scramble to accommodate the theft so the family aesthetic remained intact. If I deviated from that established script, they might panic. They might destroy the silk to hide the evidence before the wedding. I could not allow that to happen. I needed them to bring that gown to the Hamptons. I needed them to parade it in front of the cameras. To ensure they walked into the trap with their heads held high, they had to believe I was broken. I had to feed their egos until they were blind to the danger. I initiated a calculated sequence of panic. I stayed in my workroom late on a Tuesday evening. I pulled out a fresh sheet of thick drafting paper. Usually my sketches are precise architectural blueprints of lace and structure. This time, I drew like a frantic amateur. I sketched a rushed, uninspired silhouette. I gave it a basic sweetheart neckline and a chaotic explosion of cheap tulle. It was the kind of desperate last-minute garment a bride might throw together if her true dress vanished overnight. To sell the illusion, I flicked a few drops of tap water onto the charcoal lines. The water blurred the graphite, making it look exactly like tears staining the page. I left this pathetic drawing right in the center of my cutting table, where it could not be missed. Next, I opened my laptop. Evelyn and I still shared a digital folder for the wedding logistics. I uploaded a series of frantic vendor communications to that shared drive. I drafted emails to my fabric suppliers begging for emergency shipments of polyester blend organza. I wrote about experiencing a catastrophic inventory loss. I made sure the tone sounded hysterical and desperate. I pressed send and waited for the bait to be taken. The following afternoon, Evelyn dropped by the studio unannounced. She claimed she needed to double-check the dimensions for the reception floral arches. I knew she was conducting reconnaissance. She wanted to verify that her crime had yielded the desired result. I greeted her with deliberate exhaustion. I had applied a pale foundation under my eyes that morning to simulate a severe lack of sleep. I offered her a cup of tea with trembling hands. While I went to the back room to fetch the floral blueprints, I left the door open just a fraction. I watched her through the gap in the hinges. Evelyn walked straight to my cutting table. She leaned over the tear-stained sketch. She read the frantic emails printed out and placed strategically next to the drafting paper. I saw her shoulders drop. A subtle sigh of relief escaped her lips. She believed her younger daughter was defeated. She believed Isabella was safe from any suspicion. When I returned to the main room, Evelyn pulled me into a warm embrace. She stroked my hair and told me everything would be fine. She was comforting the victim of her own heist. It took every ounce of my willpower to lean into that hug and play the grateful daughter. The true test of my performance occurred 2 days later at a Sunday brunch. Isabella invited me to a luxury cafe on the Upper East Side. It was a space decorated in pale pinks and brushed brass, filled with women who treated brunch as a competitive sport. Isabella had a specific reason for wanting to see me. She had a string of failed relationships over the past 5 years. Evan, my fiancé, was wealthy, grounded, and fiercely loyal. My happiness was a mirror reflecting her own insecurities. She needed to look into my eyes and see misery to feel better about her own life. I arrived 15 minutes late to sell my disorganized state. Isabella was already seated at a corner booth. She wore a tailored linen suit and sipped a mimosa. Her skin glowed. She radiated the intoxicating energy of a woman who believed she had finally secured her status as the apex predator of our family. Evelyn sat next to her, radiating maternal pride. I slid into the booth across from them. I let my posture slump. I ordered a black coffee and stared blankly at the menu. Isabella placed a manicured hand over mine. Her touch felt like a cold reptile. She tilted her head, mimicking deep empathy. She asked how the wedding preparations were going. She noted that I looked terribly stressed. I took a deep breath, letting my voice crack just a fraction. I told them a disaster had struck the studio. I lied and said a pipe burst in the storage room, ruining several key pieces. I confessed that my own bridal gown was destroyed beyond repair. Isabella gasped. It was a flawless theatrical gasp. She covered her mouth, feigning shock. Evelyn chimed in, shaking her head and murmuring about bad luck. Isabella squeezed my hand tighter. She offered me false, sugary sympathy. She said it was such a tragedy, but reminded me that Evan was marrying me for my heart, not my wardrobe. She told me I would look beautiful even in a rushed, last-minute rag. She even offered to lend me an old pearl necklace to distract from the cheap fabric. She was vibrating with glee. In her mind, she had already won. She had forced me to walk down the aisle in cheap tulle, while she planned to arrive in custom European silk. It was a delicious, suffocating tension. I sat there eating a pastry, playing the part of the humiliated younger sibling. I maintained a frantic, anxious facade. I complained about fabric delays and tailoring nightmares. Every time I mentioned my fake struggles, Isabella's smile widened just a fraction. She ordered another round of champagne to celebrate the beautiful summer weather. She toasted to my upcoming nuptials with a glittering triumph in her eyes. Beneath the table, my hands rested calmly in my lap. My pulse was steady. While my face performed a tragedy, my inner auditor calmly tallied the growing list of their liabilities. I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on my mother's wrist. I looked at the designer handbag sitting on the leather bench next to my sister. I calculated the retail value of their hubris. The cost of the ruined dress was $150,000. The legal fees for my corporate attorney would easily add another $30,000. The civil damages for corporate sabotage could push the final invoice past $250,000. They sat across from me laughing over expensive drinks. They were blinded by their impending high society victory. They thought I was mourning a ruined wedding. They never stopped to wonder why the authorities had not contacted them. They never questioned why a luxury designer did not have a contingency plan for a burst pipe. Their arrogance was their blind spot. They assumed my silence was submission, because it had always been submission in the past. I finished my coffee and excused myself, claiming I had to rush back to the studio to salvage some organza. Isabella kissed my cheek. She told me to take care of myself. As I walked out of the cafe and stepped onto the sunlit pavement of the avenue, I let the exhausted facade drop. My posture straightened. The performance was over. The bait was swallowed. The trap was now fully armed, but the execution required precise timing. The Hamptons' wedding was less than a week away. 200 of the most powerful people in New York were preparing their weekend wardrobes. My corporate attorney, Victoria, had already secured the draft for the warrant. The local precinct was ready. The tracking beacon inside the stolen silk continued to transmit a steady signal from the outer boroughs. But while Isabella focused on altering my stolen work, I had a different problem to solve. I still needed to get married. The pathetic sketch I left on my desk was a prop. It was never meant to be sewn. I am a premier designer. I was not going to walk toward my future husband wearing polyester. I had a secondary project hidden far away from the prying eyes of my family. It was a garment I had been constructing in total secrecy long before the theft occurred. Moving that secret project out to the coast without tipping off my mother required a logistical miracle. The clock was ticking. I had to orchestrate the delivery of my true wedding gown past Evelyn's watchful gaze while maintaining the illusion of a broken bride. The real challenge of the Hamptons was about to begin. Haute couture is an unforgiving discipline. It does not stretch or forgive or accommodate a lie. When I built the Sovereign, I engineered it for a very specific skeletal structure. Princess Elena, the original client, spent her youth riding horses competitively across European estates. Her shoulders are broad and athletic, her torso is elongated, and her hips are narrow. The gown was constructed to drape perfectly over those specific geometric coordinates. Isabella, on the other hand, relies on padded garments and expensive shapewear to create an illusion. Her frame is 5 inches shorter, and her shoulders slope downward. If my sister simply stepped into that crushed silk, it would pool around her ankles like a discarded sheet. The bodice would gap at the chest, exposing the intricate inner boning. She could not just steal the dress and put it on. She had to alter it. I sat at my desk and watched the red dot on my secure tracking portal. It had remained stationary in her Upper East Side apartment for 2 full days. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, it began to move. It bypassed the fashion district entirely. It did not stop at any reputable atelier on Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue. Legitimate tailors ask questions. They recognize hand-beaded European silk the moment they touch it. They demand receipts and provenance before their scissors come anywhere near a 6-figure garment. Isabella knew she could not walk into a high-end business with a stolen masterpiece. The tracking beacon crossed the East River. It traveled deep into a dense commercial sector of Queens. It stopped at an address listed as a discount dry cleaner and alteration shop. It was a cash-only storefront. It was the kind of place where a seamstress works in a cramped back room under flickering fluorescent lights, charging $50 an hour and asking 0 questions about where the merchandise came from. I closed my eyes and visualized what was happening in that dusty back room. I imagined a tired worker taking a pair of heavy industrial shears to the delicate French seams I had spent weeks perfecting. To make the dress fit Isabella, they had to sever the original threadwork. They had to hack through the layers of silk organza and separate the hand-sewn micro-pearls from the bodice. Every cut they made sent delicate beads scattering across a cheap linoleum floor. Every forced seam permanently destroyed the structural integrity of the masterpiece. A garment of that caliber cannot be casually tailored. It is an architectural marvel. Once you breach the foundation, it loses all monetary value. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cold clarity of an accountant watching an asset depreciate to zero in real time. My sister was taking scissors to my life's work. She thought she was just making the dress fit her body so she could outshine me. She did not realize she was actively manufacturing the undeniable physical evidence of her own financial ruin. This physical alteration shifted the entire legal landscape of our situation. I picked up my phone and called Victoria. Victoria is the senior partner at a boutique Manhattan law firm specializing in corporate defense and intellectual property. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn and clawed her way to the top of the legal food chain through sheer intellect and ruthlessness. She does not deal in family therapy or emotional apologies. She deals in leverage and liability. She walked into my studio an hour later carrying a slim leather briefcase and a cup of black coffee. We sat at my conference table and I pushed my laptop toward her. I showed her the live tracking data alongside the original technical blueprints of the dress. Victoria traced the digital route on the map with her manicured finger. She leaned back in her chair and smiled. It was a terrifying clinical smile. She explained the state statutes with predatory precision. Taking the garment out of my locked studio was grand larceny. That alone carried a heavy penalty and possible jail time. But taking a blade to the fabric elevated the crime. It became the deliberate destruction of a heavily insured corporate asset. The insurance underwriters would view this as corporate sabotage. The damages were compounding by the hour. Victoria pulled out a yellow legal pad and a gold pen. She began writing down numbers in neat, sharp columns. The base cost of the dress was $150,000. The breach of contract with the royal client added another $50,000 in immediate penalties. The legal fees for her firm would stack on top of that base. The civil damages for emotional distress and brand reputation could push the final invoice past $250,000. We did not draft our response as a wounded sibling seeking revenge or a daughter seeking her mother's approval. We prepared our strategy as a unified, aggrieved corporation executing a catastrophic financial strike. We formalized the paperwork right there in my studio. Victoria drafted a preservation of evidence notice. She prepared the documents required to secure a search warrant. She coordinated with a contact at the local Hamptons precinct to ensure the officers would be waiting out of sight when the wedding ceremony began. She handled the legal machinery with a quiet efficiency that let me focus on my own role in this theater. Isabella was hacking apart a priceless gown, unaware she was simultaneously shredding her own bank accounts and her future standing in New York society. Victoria packed her briefcase and left me alone in the studio. The legal trap was set, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. But a new logistical nightmare immediately presented itself. I had spent the last few days performing the role of the broken bride. I had convinced my mother and sister that I was walking down the aisle in a cheap, rushed piece of tulle. They believed my true wedding dress was gone. But I am a premier designer. I was never going to walk toward my future husband wearing polyester. I had a secondary project, hidden far away from the prying eyes of my family. It was a garment I had been constructing in total secrecy long before the theft occurred. It was an icy platinum architectural gown designed to command the room. Moving that secret project out to the Hamptons coast without tipping off my mother required a logistical miracle. Evelyn was hovering over every detail of the wedding transportation. She monitored the delivery trucks and the vendor schedules, hoping to revel in my misery. I had to orchestrate the delivery of my true wedding gown right past her watchful gaze. The clock was ticking down to the rehearsal dinner. I had to smuggle a masterpiece out of Manhattan while maintaining the illusion of a defeated woman. The real challenge of the weekend was just beginning. The dawn broke over the eastern seaboard, bringing a crisp, salty breeze off the Atlantic Ocean. Our chosen venue was a monumental coastal manor situated on the most exclusive peninsula of the state. This sprawling property served as a fortified playground for the financial titans and fashion moguls of the city. Wrought iron gates protected miles of pristine landscaping. Towering limestone walls guarded secrets and fortunes equally. Events hosted in this zip code were never merely celebrations. They functioned as brutal social arenas, where every aesthetic choice was scrutinized by ruthless peers. I sat inside the opulent master suite on the second floor overlooking the crashing waves. The atmosphere within those four walls felt incredibly dense. The air carried the heavy scent of expensive botanical hair products, mingling with chilled vintage champagne. Beneath the surface, a profound, unspoken hostility pulsed through the room. Isabella commanded the primary vanity station near the expansive bay windows. She vibrated with a frantic, manic energy. My older sibling waved her manicured hands widely while boasting to my assigned bridesmaids. She loudly declared that she had orchestrated a custom surprise for the upcoming procession. She refused to divulge specific details. She simply offered a radiant, smug grin and promised her entrance would dominate the social columns for the rest of the year. Her vanity operated like a bottomless chasm. When we were younger, she routinely orchestrated spectacular meltdowns whenever an authority figure praised my work. If a teacher complimented my sketches, she would destroy them. If a relative praised my academic record, she would suddenly develop a mysterious illness to redirect the attention. She firmly believed the spotlight belonged exclusively to her. Today, she felt utterly invincible. She assumed she had successfully hijacked my wedding and relegated me to the background of my own life. My mother maintained a constant vigil near the heavy oak doorway. Evelyn kept her fingers laced tightly together, acting as a self-appointed sentinel. Her facial expression featured a stretched, fragile smile. She continually darted anxious glances in my direction. Evelyn desperately searched my posture for any sign of the crippling anxiety she was so accustomed to managing. In previous years, a stunt of this magnitude would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack. My mother historically thrived during my moments of weakness. My breakdowns allowed her to play the benevolent peacemaker while quietly endorsing her favored daughter's cruelty. She wanted to see my hands shake. She desired my total submission. I provided her with absolutely nothing. I remained perfectly still, seated in a plush velvet armchair. I casually sipped a double espresso from a delicate porcelain saucer. A professional makeup artist carefully blended contouring powder along my jawline. I regulated my breathing, keeping my exterior completely serene. The era of shedding tears over familial betrayals had expired 2 decades prior. I mourned the absence of a loving household long before this summer weekend ever materialized. Today was reserved strictly for the corporate ledger. I observed my sister's reflection through an antique gilded mirror. I watched her arrogant display, possessing the clinical detachment of a senior scientist monitoring a doomed laboratory experiment. A suffocating blanket of dramatic irony covered the suite. Isabella sat there chattering endlessly about high society status. She genuinely believed she was merely hours away from cementing her reputation as the most stunning individual on the eastern seaboard. She remained entirely ignorant of the massive legal machinery already grinding into motion. She did not know my corporate attorney, Victoria, had spent the morning finalizing a sealed criminal warrant. My sister possessed no clue that a highly respected federal judge was currently reviewing penal codes regarding grand larceny down the hall in the groom's staging area. She remained oblivious to the fact that local law enforcement cruisers were quietly taking up positions outside the perimeter walls. Isabella thought she was preparing for a royal coronation. In reality, she was applying makeup for her own highly publicized felony arrest. The bridesmaids fluttered around the expansive space, adjusting their matching lavender chiffon dresses. They frequently shot me deeply sympathetic looks. Evelyn had deliberately leaked the false narrative of my ruined wardrobe to the entire bridal party. My friends genuinely thought I was being incredibly courageous by keeping my emotions contained. They believed I was preparing to walk down a gravel aisle wearing a cheap polyester disaster while my sister wore a masterpiece. I performed my assigned role flawlessly. I offered the girls tight, brave smiles and quietly thanked them for their unwavering support. I allowed them to pity me. Their current sympathy would only amplify the sheer shock value of my eventual triumphant entrance. While the suite hummed with superficial gossip, my brain calculated a complex series of logistical maneuvers. Smuggling my true bridal gown out of Manhattan and into this coastal fortress required a staggering amount of deception. I could not risk utilizing standard courier services because Evelyn monitored the vendor delivery logs obsessively. Instead, I instructed Victoria to transport my platinum architectural masterpiece, hidden inside a massive cardboard box labeled as confidential legal discovery files. That unassuming box currently sat locked inside a climate-controlled humidor room on the ground floor. Victoria held the only physical key. As the grandfather clock chimed, signaling the start of the preliminary photography sessions, the tension in my chest amplified. The pressure did not stem from fear. It originated from the required precision of my upcoming tactical movements. I desperately needed to separate myself from Evelyn's suffocating surveillance. I had to physically transition out of my silk lounging robe and step into my actual armor without my mother intercepting the process. If Evelyn laid eyes on the platinum silk before the ceremony began, she would instantly realize her trap had failed. She might sprint to warn Isabella. That action could prompt my sibling to abandon the stolen merchandise before the authorities could officially witness the crime taking place. The entire operation depended on maintaining the illusion of my defeat until the absolute last possible second. I finished my espresso and gently placed the delicate cup onto a glass side table. The ceramic clink instantly captured my mother's attention. I stood up and smoothed the lapels of my robe. I announced to the room that I required 15 minutes of absolute privacy to finalize my written vows. I politely asked the styling team to pack up their brushes. I requested that my bridal party head down to the outdoor terrace for the scheduled mimosa service. Evelyn immediately stepped forward, blocking my path. She offered to stay behind and help me steady my frayed nerves. Her voice dripped with an artificial maternal concern that made my stomach turn. I looked directly into her eyes, refusing to blink. I kept my vocal tone flat and completely uncompromising. I told her I needed to be entirely alone. The sheer, icy coldness of my delivery caused her to physically recoil. She had never heard me speak with such absolute authority. She nodded stiffly, gathered her designer purse, and exited the room. Her lifelong control over my emotions was momentarily shattered. The heavy suite door clicked shut, leaving me bathed in total silence. I exhaled a slow, measured breath. The first phase of the morning was successfully completed. The elite audience was gathering on the lawn. The bait was actively in play. Now I possessed exactly 15 minutes to navigate a hidden labyrinth of back hallways and servant staircases to reach the humidor. Victoria was waiting for me there with my true attire and the final briefing regarding the police barricade. I turned the brass knob of the secondary exit leading toward the private corridors. Suddenly, a frantic knock echoed against the main door. It was not my mother returning. It was the head venue coordinator. Her voice, muffled through the thick wood, carried an unmistakable note of sheer panic. She informed me there was an unauthorized guest causing a massive disturbance near the front lawn security checkpoint. My pulse spiked instantly. I had accounted for every single legal variable. I had anticipated every familial betrayal. I had not prepared for an external anomaly threatening to detonate the entire undercover operation before Isabella even reached the aisle. I opened the heavy wooden door just a fraction. The venue coordinator stood in the carpeted hallway, clutching her digital tablet tightly against her chest. She was out of breath. Her eyes were wide with panic as she reported a sudden standoff at the main iron security gates. An uninvited black SUV featuring diplomatic license plates was blocking the entrance. The occupants refused to surrender their vehicles to the standard valet service, and they were declining to pass through the metal detectors. I knew exactly who was sitting inside that fortified vehicle. I had personally orchestrated their arrival. Princess Elena did not travel lightly. As a ranking member of a European royal house, she moved through the world with a dedicated protection detail. I had sent her a private encrypted invitation to this wedding 2 days after discovering the theft of her custom gown. I needed her physical presence on the estate grounds to authenticate the stolen property. I kept my voice calm and low. I instructed the coordinator to bypass the standard security protocols immediately. I ordered her to issue the occupants our premium corporate clearance lanyards and to seat the primary guests discreetly in the third row on the groom's side. The coordinator nodded hastily and rushed back toward the front lawn. I slipped through the secondary exit of my suite and entered the service corridors. The contrast between the opulent guest areas and the utilitarian staff hallways mirrored my own dual existence. The service corridors featured bare concrete floors and exposed ventilation pipes. For years, I operated in the shadows of my family, serving their emotional needs, while they bathed in the spotlight. I navigated the narrow stairwell descending toward the ground floor with deliberate speed. I needed to reach the humidor room before Evelyn realized I was missing from the bridal quarters. I located the heavy mahogany door of the humidor and stepped inside. The air in the room smelled deeply of rich cedar and aged tobacco. The climate control system hummed a low, steady rhythm. Victoria stood near the center of the dark space. My corporate attorney wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected pure boardroom warfare. Next to her polished leather shoes rested the large cardboard shipping carton disguised as confidential legal discovery files. Victoria did not offer a warm wedding day greeting. She operated purely on efficiency. She produced a small silver key from her blazer pocket and unlocked the heavy brass padlock securing the carton. I reached inside the box and unzipped the protective garment bag. There was no cheap polyester tulle hiding inside. There was no traditional bridal lace or predictable sweetheart neckline. I lifted my actual wedding attire into the dim light of the cedar-lined room. It was an architectural platinum gown. The fabric consisted of heavy structured silk that gleamed with the cold, hard luster of polished steel. It featured sharp asymmetrical lines and a sculpted bodice engineered to project undeniable authority. I had drafted the patterns for this piece during the quiet hours of the night, working in total secrecy over the past 6 months. It was meant to command a room rather than beg for its attention. It stood as the exact antithesis of Isabella's frothy, stolen fantasy. While my sister sought to dress herself as a fragile fairy tale princess, I had forged a suit of armor. Victoria looked up from her digital tablet. Her expression remained sharp and calculating. She confirmed the legal machinery was locked into place. The search and seizure warrant was officially signed by a state magistrate 20 minutes prior. 2 local police cruisers were currently idling, out of sight, parked behind the manicured, tall hedges near the perimeter walls. The officers had their instructions. They were waiting for a specific signal from Victoria to breach the property line. I removed my silk lounging robe and let it fall to the cedar floor. I stepped into the platinum gown. As the heavy, cool fabric settled against my skin, a profound psychological shift occurred within my mind. The submissive younger sibling ceased to exist. The girl who used to cry when her sister blew out her birthday candles faded into history. I was the chief executive officer of a highly profitable brand. I stood at the helm of my own life, and I was preparing to execute a hostile takeover of my family dynamic. Victoria stepped behind me to secure the intricate closures along my spine. We shared a long history of repelling my mother's toxic entitlement. When I secured my first round of major investment capital for the atelier, Evelyn tried to force me to hire Isabella as my creative director. Isabella possessed 0 design experience, but she wanted the prestigious title for her social media profiles. Evelyn threatened to boycott my launch party if I refused to comply. Victoria was the one who drafted the ironclad operating agreement that legally barred my family from ever interfering with my board of directors. She understood the exact financial and emotional cost of my mother's enablement. I turned to face the mirrored wall of the humidor. The platinum silk draped flawlessly over my frame. The icy metallic hue contrasted sharply against the warm summer light filtering through the high windows. I looked untouchable. Victoria tapped the screen of her tablet, verifying the GPS coordinates one final time. She confirmed the tracking beacon inside the stolen dress was currently situated on the second floor of the estate. Isabella was exactly where she needed to be. The trap was armed, and the bait was pacing the floorboards above us. The distant sound of a string quartet warming up drifted through the ventilation grates. The musicians were tuning their instruments on the main lawn. The prelude was officially beginning. The 200 elite guests were taking their seats, expecting a traditional display of wealth and romance. I took a deep, steady breath, preparing to step out of the shadows and preside over my sister's spectacular social execution. I was ready to watch her arrogance fund my corporate expansion. But before Victoria could lock her tablet and escort me to the staging area, her secure mobile device vibrated sharply on the cedar table. She picked up the phone and read the incoming encrypted text message. I watched the muscles in her jaw tighten. A severe frown creased her forehead. Victoria rarely showed surprise, but the contents of that message caused her to exhale a harsh, frustrated breath. The venue coordinator had just radioed a frantic update from the starting line of the processional. Isabella had decided to go completely off script. She was refusing to line up in her designated spot with the groomsmen. My sister was demanding a solo procession down the gravel aisle to maximize her photographic exposure. She was throwing a massive temper tantrum in the staging tent and holding the entire ceremony hostage until the event staff agreed to alter the musical cues. This spontaneous display of pure vanity threatened to derail the precise timing of our police strike, forcing Victoria and me to recalculate our entire legal ambush on the fly. Victoria stared at the encrypted text message illuminating her mobile device. Her sharp features hardened into a mask of pure calculation. My older sibling was throwing a childish tantrum inside the staging tent. She refused to walk alongside the groomsmen. She demanded a solo procession down the gravel aisle to maximize her photographic exposure. She was holding the entire ceremony hostage until the event staff agreed to alter the scheduled musical cues. I looked at my corporate attorney and felt a cold smile form on my lips. I instructed Victoria to grant the request immediately. We informed the head coordinator to hold the bridal party back. Isabella desired the runway all to herself. We would gladly give her the entire stage. Isolating the target makes the eventual strike much cleaner. By walking alone, she would ensure every single camera lens remained fixed exclusively on her stolen garment. She was requesting a solo spotlight for her own public execution. The 200 attendees occupying the white wooden folding chairs arranged across the manicured coastal grass represented the absolute apex of the metropolitan hierarchy. This specific demographic did not attend weddings to celebrate love. They attended to reinforce their social boundaries. There were billionaire hedge fund directors who manipulated global markets before breakfast, sitting next to powerful charity board presidents. Ruthless fashion magazine editors occupied the premium aisle seats. These individuals communicated entirely through subtle gestures, a slightly raised eyebrow, a tight-lipped smile, or a deliberate avoidance of eye contact served as a lethal verdict in their world. This particular ecosystem thrived on gossip. They hungered for scandal to break the monotony of their privileged existences. However, they mercilessly exiled anyone who violated their strict aesthetic regulations. Wearing a bespoke bridal gown as a guest was not merely a faux pas, it was considered a grotesque display of unearned ego. Breaking such a fundamental rule required a level of untouchable prestige that my sister simply did not possess. Isabella assumed these titans of industry would forgive her trespass if she merely looked stunning. She believed her physical attractiveness granted her immunity from high society etiquette. She fundamentally misunderstood her audience. They did not reward desperation. They cataloged it. They would memorize every flawed seam and every inappropriate detail of her entrance to use as social ammunition later. The hired string quartet began playing a delicate classical composition. The gentle notes drifted over the ocean breeze, attempting to mask the underlying tension gripping the estate. The groom side of the aisle featured generations of established wealth. Evan's relatives wore understated bespoke suits and vintage family jewels. They already viewed my mother and sibling with polite disdain. Isabella staging a solo walk would confirm their worst suspicions regarding her character. They were waiting for a graceful ceremony. They were about to witness a crime. I stood concealed inside a ground-floor holding room located just behind the main terrace. I monitored the gathering assembly through a narrow gap in the heavy velvet curtains. The cool glass of the window pane rested against my forehead. I regulated my breathing while observing the chessboard I had painstakingly arranged. 40 yards away, beyond the wrought iron perimeter gates, the press corps waited. Freelance photographers and society columnists had their telephoto lenses aimed directly at the white gravel runner. They functioned as the unofficial record keepers of the elite class. Isabella wanted them to document her unparalleled beauty. I needed them to document her felony. Every flash of their cameras would serve as time-stamped evidence for our civil lawsuit. But the true lethal component of my trap rested quietly in the third row. Princess Elena occupied a seat near the center aisle. She wore a wide-brimmed navy hat and dark sunglasses to obscure her famous features. The European aristocrat had flown across the Atlantic Ocean specifically for this event. When I first discovered the theft of her bespoke garment, I immediately contacted her private office. I explained the situation with total transparency. I offered a full refund and a public apology. Elena did not demand her money back. She requested a flight itinerary and an invitation to the venue. Elena possessed a fierce, unyielding temperament forged by years of competitive equestrian jumping. She understood the immense value of artistic craftsmanship. She viewed the unauthorized alteration of the dress as a severe personal insult to her royal house. She did not just want financial compensation. She wanted to look the thief directly in the eye. Isabella believed she possessed the ultimate upper hand. She thought the only obstacle to her triumph was my hurt feelings. She remained entirely ignorant of the fact that the actual rightful owner of her stolen silk was sitting directly in her path. Elena was waiting patiently to inspect her damaged property from less than 5 feet away. The princess sat with perfect posture, holding a sleek leather clutch resting on her lap. She projected the terrifying calm of a predator watching a wounded animal wander into a clearing. The logistics of the ceremony required precise timing. Victoria typed a quick confirmation code into her tablet, sending the final authorization to the local precinct units waiting outside. The legal machinery was fully armed. We only needed the target to step into the designated kill zone. Inside my hidden viewing room, the ambient noise of the estate shifted. The gentle classical music abruptly ceased. The head coordinator waved a discreet hand signal toward the musicians. Isabella had officially forced her revised itinerary upon the staff. The quartet adjusted their sheet music and began to play a soaring, dramatic march. It was a piece of music traditionally reserved for royalty. My sister had selected it specifically to announce her solo arrival. The sudden change in the musical program caused a ripple of confusion to spread through the seated guests. The fashion editors stopped whispering. The hedge fund managers lowered their sunglasses. The entire audience turned their collective attention toward the grand oak doors of the main estate house. They expected to see me, the bride, stepping out to begin the procession. I pulled the velvet curtain back just another fraction of an inch. My platinum architectural gown gleamed softly in the shadows of the holding room. I was not walking out those doors. I was letting my sister take the stage. The heavy brass handles of the estate doors began to turn. The oak panels slowly swung outward, revealing the bright sunlit terrace. Isabella stepped onto the top of the stairs. She paused deliberately, ensuring every single telephoto lens outside the gates captured her silhouette. The stolen crushed silk cascaded around her feet, reflecting the afternoon light. She raised her chin, preparing to soak in the adoration of the wealthiest individuals in the state. She took her first confident step downward onto the white gravel runner. But the reaction from the crowd was not the breathless admiration she had planned for. As her high heels crunched against the stones, the atmosphere on the lawn instantly evaporated into a chilling, suffocating vacuum. The elite attendees did not gasp in awe. They recoiled. A collective low murmur of pure, undisguised disgust began to build from the back rows, sweeping forward like a toxic wave. Isabella faltered mid-stride as she noticed the prominent fashion editors in the second row physically turning their shoulders away from her in blatant rejection. Her triumphant solo march was unraveling before she even reached the midway point of the aisle. The gasp that rippled through the seated assembly was not a sound of awe. It was the sharp, collective inhalation of high society horror. In the rarefied air of a Hampton summer estate, silence rarely signifies respect. Silence is the weapon this demographic unsheathes when an unforgivable boundary is breached. Isabella stepped onto the pristine white runner, bathed in the bright July sun, wearing the stolen silk. She paused at the top of the stone stairs, elevating her chin to catch the afternoon light. She misinterpreted the frozen, scandalized quiet of 200 elite guests as a form of breathless admiration. She genuinely believed her beauty had stunned a crowd of billionaires and fashion moguls into submission. She smiled a radiant, toxic grin, fueled by the delusion of a sibling who thought she had finally conquered the spotlight. My sister began her descent down the gravel aisle. She did not walk with the measured grace of a guest honoring a sacred ceremony. She strutted. She placed one stiletto directly in front of the other, treating the white runner like a competitive fashion runway. She twisted her shoulders slightly at every third step, ensuring the telephoto lenses stationed 40 yards away captured optimal angles of her profile. She wanted the world to see her wearing a masterpiece. But the audience seated on the manicured lawn possessed highly trained eyes. They did not see a goddess. They saw a trespasser wearing a damaged garment. The sovereign was engineered with architectural precision for a towering equestrian frame. The clandestine tailor and queens had hacked the bodice to accommodate my sister's shorter stature. To the untrained eye, the cascading crushed silk still looked expensive. To the seasoned magazine editors sitting in the second row, the structural failures were glaring. The neckline gaped slightly. The frantic stitches used to alter the waistline caught the sunlight, revealing cheap synthetic thread that clashed with the hand-sewn micro-pearls. The elite attendees did not need to know the dress was stolen to recognize it had been butchered. They whispered behind their programs, cataloging every flawed seam. My mother sat in the front row on the bride's side, actively sanctioning this ultimate betrayal. Evelyn held a delicate lace handkerchief to her cheek, dabbing at artificial tears. She performed the role of the deeply moved matriarch, weeping at the sheer beauty of her eldest daughter. Evelyn spent her entire life nurturing Isabella's fragile ego because a dependent child is a controllable child. My independence and my corporate success always threatened my mother's need for supreme authority. By allowing Isabella to steal my wedding day, Evelyn believed she was putting me back in my designated place. She nodded encouragingly as Isabella strutted closer. Evelyn thought she had orchestrated a harmless family victory. She failed to comprehend that her front row seat was located at ground zero of a pending legal detonation. I observed the entire spectacle from the shadows of the holding room. I stood behind the velvet curtain feeling a profound clinical detachment. I did not feel a single tremor of betrayal. The girl who used to seek her mother's approval died long before this afternoon. The woman standing in the holding room was a chief executive officer auditing a hostile entity. I watched my sister parade down the aisle, and I saw pure, undeniable evidence. Every step Isabella took on that white gravel was another line item on her impending invoice. Her unadulterated vanity provided the exact documentation my attorney required to secure a conviction. Victoria stood next to me, holding her digital tablet. She recorded the live feed from the venue's security cameras, saving the high-definition footage directly to our secure, firm servers. We did not need to hire private investigators to prove the theft. Isabella was broadcasting her crime to the wealthiest zip code in the state. She was wearing stolen corporate property in front of 200 witnesses, while hired photographers documented her every angle. She was doing the work of the prosecution for us. Beyond the wrought iron gates, the paparazzi pressed their lenses against the metal bars. The flashes of their cameras strobed rapidly in the bright sunlight. These photographers did not care about the etiquette of wearing white to a wedding. They cared about the sheer audacity of the visual. They recognized a lucrative scandal unfolding in real time. Isabella tilted her head toward the gates, offering them a coy smile. She assumed those images would secure her a feature spread in upcoming lifestyle magazines. She did not realize those exact photographs would serve as exhibits in a civil lawsuit. The press corps was immortalizing her downfall. Isabella continued her march past the first row of guests. The relatives seated on Evan's side of the aisle maintained stony expressions. They belonged to families with generational wealth and impeccable breeding. They viewed this stunt with icy disdain. Evan's grandmother refused to even look at the runner, keeping her gaze fixed firmly on the floral arrangements at the altar. The silence surrounding my sister grew heavier with each passing yard. The initial shock wore off, leaving behind a thick, palpable judgment. The heavy, crushed silk proved difficult to manage. The black market tailor had failed to properly hem the cascading train. Isabella had to subtly kick the fabric forward with her toes to avoid tripping over the ruined foundation. Her radiant smile began to strain at the corners. She expected someone to stand. She anticipated scattered applause or at least audible murmurs of jealousy. She received nothing but cold, unforgiving stares. The isolation on that white runner was total. She was an island of unauthorized silk, surrounded by an ocean of elite rejection. Yet her arrogance pushed her forward. She believed she simply needed to reach the front to secure her final victory. She kept her eyes focused on the altar, refusing to acknowledge the turning shoulders and the shielding hands of the guests beside her. She passed the second row, where the fashion editors scribbled notes on their ivory programs. She remained blind to the trap closing around her ankles. The true danger did not reside at the altar. The true danger was seated quietly in the third row on the groom's side. Isabella stepped into the midpoint of the aisle. The grand march music swelled through the concealed outdoor speakers, providing a dramatic soundtrack to her parade. She approached the exact row where Princess Elena waited. The royal client sat perfectly still, shielded by her dark sunglasses and wide-brimmed navy hat. Isabella did not even register the presence of the European aristocrat. My sister only saw an audience of stepping stones meant to elevate her own status. She prepared to glide past the third row, ready to claim her spot near my future husband. She took another confident step forward, her stilettos crunching loudly against the white stones. She never anticipated that one of those stepping stones would rise up and shatter her illusion entirely. Isabella placed her satin heel onto the stones marking the exact middle of the runner. The midday sun beat down on the coastal lawn, creating a blinding glare off the nearby ocean. She maintained her measured strut, determined to reach the floral archway and claim her unearned victory. Her eyes remained locked on the altar, ignoring the turning shoulders and the shielding hands of the guests flanking her path. She assumed the quiet reception stemmed from sheer intimidation. She believed her visual presentation simply overwhelmed their senses. She remained totally ignorant of the European aristocrat occupying the aisle seat in the third row. Princess Elena did not attend high society functions to blend in. She hailed from a long lineage of monarchs who understood the precise value of bespoke craftsmanship and architectural fashion. Elena possessed an eye trained to identify authenticity from 100 yards away. We had spent countless hours over secure video calls, meticulously designing the beadwork for the sovereign. She had personally selected the exact shade of the French silk to match her complexion. She knew every curve and every seam of that $150,000 investment. As Isabella drew closer, Elena leaned forward slightly. The royal client lowered her dark sunglasses, resting them on the bridge of her nose. Her sharp gaze scanned the cascading fabric dragging across the gravel. She recognized the intricate pattern of the micropearls clustered around the waistline. It was a signature motif I had hand-drawn exclusively for her royal house. Elena then traced her eyes upward, noting the gaping bodice and the crude, uneven stitches marring the neckline. She saw the undeniable evidence of a cheap discount tailor hacking into her customized property. A slow, dangerous realization settled over the princess. She did not feel mere irritation. She felt a profound, aristocratic insult. Someone had stolen her commissioned artwork and paraded it through a common garden party like a cheap costume. Isabella took another step, the heavy silk rustling loudly. She offered a coy smile toward the right side of the aisle, expecting a camera flash. Elena did not wait for the music to conclude. She did not consult with her security detail or look to the event staff for permission. The princess simply stood up. Her movement was fluid and entirely devoid of hesitation. When a ranking member of a royal family rises, the surrounding environment instinctively responds to the shift in gravity. The hedge fund managers sitting next to her immediately straightened their postures. The fashion editors behind her stopped their frantic note-taking. The string quartet, sensing a severe disruption, faltered slightly, their bows hovering over the strings. Elena removed her sunglasses entirely, folding them with a crisp snap. She stepped out from the row of white wooden chairs, planting herself directly in the center of the gravel path. She blocked Isabella's route to the altar like a towering marble statue. Isabella stopped short. Her stiletto caught on the hem of the butchered silk, causing her to stumble forward just a fraction of an inch. She looked at the tall, elegant woman standing in her way with a mixture of deep confusion and rising annoyance. My sister opened her mouth, preparing to deliver a condescending remark to clear her path. Elena spoke first. Her voice did not require a microphone to command the manicured lawn. She projected her words using the undeniable weight of European nobility. The tone she employed carried zero anger. It possessed an icy, clinical disgust that froze the blood of everyone within a 50-foot radius. "That is my dress," Elena stated. The 4 words hung over the coastal estate, ringing with sharp clarity. The princess did not shout. She simply laid claim to her stolen property in front of 200 of the wealthiest individuals in the state. The suffocating silence that had previously blanketed the audience instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. The polite, restrained horror of an etiquette breach mutated into the chaotic, vicious buzzing of a criminal scandal. The high society crowd realized simultaneously that they were not merely witnessing a desperate sibling rivalry. They were sitting in the front row of a grand larceny execution. The murmurs began low and quickly escalated into an audible roar. Whispers swept across the folding chairs like a sudden wildfire. The fashion moguls in the second row instantly pulled out their mobile devices. They recognized the European princess. They connected the timeline of my missing masterpiece to the current display of stolen silk. The hedge fund directors leaned across the aisle, exchanging betting odds on how quickly the police would arrive. The atmosphere shifted from a curated luxury event into a ruthless public tribunal. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of the runner. The radiant, toxic smile melted off her face, exposing a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The blood drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her complexion a sickly pale hue beneath her expensive contouring makeup. She stared at Princess Elena, unable to form a coherent syllable. The reality of her situation crashed into her fragile ego with the force of a freight train. She was not the beautiful center of attention. She was standing in the middle of a Hamptons lawn, publicly identified as a common thief by international royalty. Her physical body betrayed her internal collapse. Her hands began to tremble noticeably. She clutched the heavy silk skirts, trying to shield herself from the sudden onslaught of hostile stares. The custom dress she had sacrificed my sanity to acquire suddenly morphed into an inescapable prison uniform. The tight synthetic threads the black market tailor had forced into the waistline dug into her ribs, making it difficult for her to draw a full breath. She looked around the audience, searching desperately for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The elite attendees stared back with uniform, predatory contempt. They smelled blood in the water. Beyond the wrought iron gates, the paparazzi sensed the dramatic shift in the ceremony. The freelance photographers realized this was no longer a standard society wedding. They were documenting a high-profile crime. The camera shutters from the perimeter began firing in rapid, unrelenting succession. The continuous bursts of bright white flashes created a strobe effect, illuminating Isabella's panic in high definition. Every single angle of her humiliation was being captured, time-stamped, and prepared for the morning tabloids. In the front row, Evelyn finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of her miscalculation. My mother dropped her delicate lace handkerchief onto the grass. Her jaw slacked. The artificial maternal pride vanished, replaced by a deep, paralyzing dread. She had enabled this entire heist under the delusion that stealing from her younger daughter carried zero real-world consequences. She looked at the European princess standing in the aisle and realized her harmless family favor had just offended a foreign head of state. Evelyn gripped the armrests of her folding chair, her knuckles turning white, as she tried to calculate a way to manipulate this disaster. There was no escape route. The corporate ledger was officially open, and the first enormous debt had just been called due. Isabella took a shaky step backward, her heel crunching loudly against the stones. She wanted to run. Her survival instinct screamed at her to abandon the aisle and flee toward the safety of the estate house. But the heavy, butchered train of the sovereign wrapped around her ankles, tethering her to the scene of the crime. She was trapped in the glare of the flashing cameras and the suffocating judgment of the metropolitan elite. She looked toward the altar, hoping her mother would launch out of her seat to rescue her. Evelyn remained paralyzed, unwilling to step into the crosshairs of a royal confrontation. Isabella was entirely alone on the white gravel. The stage she had stolen was now the very platform of her undoing. Inside the hidden viewing room, I watched the entire sequence unfold with cold satisfaction. The bait had been taken, and the jaws of the trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. Victoria stood beside me, tapping a final command into her digital tablet. The legal parameters were established. The public indictment was delivered. The hired string quartet, desperate to regain control of the derailed ceremony, looked toward the event coordinator for guidance. The coordinator gave a frantic hand signal pointing toward the primary entrance of the estate. The musicians abandoned their sheet music for the grand march. The cellist raised his bow, preparing to initiate the deep, resonant solo that signaled the true beginning of the wedding. The audience, buzzing with vicious gossip, suddenly hushed. They heard the shift in the musical tempo. They realized the drama on the lawn was far from over. The thief had been caught, but the ceremony still required a bride. I turned away from the cracked window and picked up my platinum bouquet. It was time for the architect of this trap to step out of the shadows and claim her rightful place at the altar. The deep, resonant notes of the solo cello pierced the chaotic murmuring on the lawn. The hired musician drew his bow across the heavy strings, producing a mournful but powerful sound. It signaled the true beginning of the ceremony. I stood hidden behind the heavy oak doors of the main estate house. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I let the cool, structured fabric of my platinum gown ground my racing thoughts. The heavy brass handles felt cold against my palms. I pushed the wooden panels forward. The afternoon sunlight hit the metallic fabric, creating a blinding halo of icy light. I stepped out onto the top of the stone stairs. The gown was an architectural marvel. It possessed zero traditional lace. It lacked the frothy, romantic tulle that society brides typically favored. The bodice featured sharp, asymmetrical lines, folded like pristine origami, from pure steel-colored silk. It functioned as armor. It demanded immediate submission from anyone looking at it. I had spent countless nights drafting this silhouette in total secrecy. While my sister sought a fairy tale aesthetic, I engineered a declaration of power. The 200 guests seated on the manicured grass had just witnessed a royal humiliation. They were buzzing with a toxic, contagious adrenaline. When I appeared at the top of the stairs, that nervous, frantic energy morphed instantly into electric reverence. The fashion editors sitting in the second row literally stopped breathing. They recognized the sheer technical brilliance of the garment. They also understood the psychological warfare playing out before them. In this elite zip code, losing your composure was considered the ultimate sin. Exhibiting raw emotion meant you were weak. By presenting a flawless, serene exterior amidst a severe family scandal, I was securing my permanent status at the top of their hierarchy. I proved I was untouchable. I placed my satin heel onto the white gravel runner. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. Every step was measured and precise. The ocean breeze caught the rigid hem of my skirt, making it glide over the stones with a soft, sweeping sound. Beyond the wrought iron gates, the paparazzi pressed their telephoto lenses against the metal bars. The frantic clicking of their camera shutters blended with the crashing of the Atlantic waves. They shifted their focus entirely away from the thief and pointed their lenses directly at me. The press corps recognized a genuine spectacle. They knew the photos of this architectural masterpiece would dominate the front pages of every lifestyle publication in the city. I kept my face smooth and unreadable. I looked straight ahead. My gaze locked onto Evan. Evan stood at the floral altar wearing a bespoke charcoal suit. He is the primary heir to a quiet but formidable commercial real estate portfolio. He navigates the treacherous waters of Manhattan society with effortless grace. When we first met at a charity gala 3 years ago, he did not ask about my family connections or my social pedigree. He asked about my business margins. He respected my sharp intellect long before he fell in love with my heart. Isabella always hated him. My sister cycled through a string of flashy, superficial relationships, seeking men who would fund her vanity and tolerate her demands. Evan saw right through her hollow facade from the very first dinner. He never coddled her. He never excused my mother's toxic enablement. He treated my relatives with polite but distant professionalism. Evan knew every single detail of this legal trap. We had spent late nights reviewing the corporate defense strategies over glasses of bourbon in our apartment. He understood that my survival required this public execution. He knew I had to sever the infected branch of my family tree to protect our future together. As I walked toward him, a faint, knowing smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a secret, private exchange of triumph between partners. He was proud of the predator I had become. I reached the midpoint of the runner. Isabella was still stranded near the third row. Princess Elena had resumed her seat, leaving my older sister isolated on the exposed gravel. Isabella looked like a frightened child wearing a damaged, ill-fitting costume. The stolen, crushed silk hung awkwardly around her waist. The cheap black market alterations were literally unraveling under the intense scrutiny of the wealthy crowd. Loose threads dangled from the hacked neckline. The bodice sagged, revealing the desperate, uneven stitches. Isabella tried to catch my eye. She shifted her weight, stepping slightly into my path. She desperately wanted me to react. She needed me to scream or cry or validate her existence with a public reprimand. Narcissists feed on any form of attention, even negative fury. If I engaged with her, I would legitimize her presence on my runner. I did not even turn my head. I kept my chin elevated. I walked past her as if she were a transparent obstacle. I did not flinch. I did not slow my pace. The denial of attention was the most lethal weapon I possessed in my arsenal. It erased her entirely. She was no longer a rival. She was merely a trespasser waiting for the police to arrive. I heard her breath hitch as I swept past. The icy platinum silk of my train brushed against the dirty hem of her stolen dress. The contrast between my architectural masterpiece and her ruined theft was startling. It was the physical manifestation of our divergent paths. I built a legacy with my own hands. She destroyed her life trying to steal mine. The visual disparity cemented her exile from our social circles. I continued toward the front row. My mother sat in her folding chair clutching a designer purse. Evelyn's hands were shaking visibly. She leaned forward, opening her mouth to speak. She wanted to interject to offer a frantic excuse to regain control of her daughters. I stared straight through her. I rendered her invisible, just as I had done to Isabella. Evelyn sank back into her seat, defeated by the sheer coldness of my gaze. Her lifelong reign of emotional manipulation ended right there on the coastal grass. She realized she possessed zero leverage over the woman I had become. The bank of unconditional forgiveness was permanently closed. I ascended the 2 wooden steps leading to the floral archway. The scent of fresh white roses and sea salt filled the air. I stopped beside Evan. He extended his hand and laced his fingers firmly through mine. His grip was warm, steady, and grounding. It anchored me to the present moment. I turned to my lead bridesmaid waiting to my left. I handed over my platinum bouquet with a crisp, efficient motion. I took a slow breath, letting the cool ocean air fill my lungs. The journey down the aisle was complete. The bait was set. The audience was captivated. I pivoted slowly to face the man standing at the center of the altar. Justice Montgomery was not a hired celebrant or a local reverend. He was a sitting federal judge. He wore his dark judicial robes over a crisp white shirt, projecting an imposing, unyielding gravity. He possessed the legal authority to alter lives and bankrupt corporations with a single signature. He held a thick, leather-bound ceremonial book in his hands. Justice Montgomery did not smile. He looked out over the seated guests, commanding immediate, total silence. His eyes swept past me, past Evan, and locked directly onto the trembling figure of my sister standing near the groomsmen. He closed his leather book with a loud, definitive snap. The sound echoed across the lawn like the cocking of a loaded weapon. The tension on the estate tightened like a pulled wire. The trap was locked. It was time for the final blow. Justice Harold Montgomery did not build his distinguished career by yielding to theatrics or indulging emotional outbursts. As a sitting magistrate within the federal judiciary, his daily existence revolved around untangling complex corporate frauds and presiding over high-stakes litigation. He was a man who possessed the rare ability to drain the oxygen from a room using nothing but his posture. His relationship with the Evans family stretched back 3 decades. They shared a quiet understanding that true power is best exercised with calculated restraint. Today, however, that restraint was being temporarily suspended. He wore his dark flowing judicial robes over a tailored suit, projecting an imposing monolithic presence against the bright coastal horizon. When I reached the floral archway, he did not offer the standard warm greeting typically reserved for a nervous bride. He remained rigid. His posture resembled a granite statue stationed at the entrance of a high court. My older sibling anticipated a highly emotional disruption. In her limited, narcissistic worldview, weddings were orchestrated by hired vendors who functioned merely as background extras. She assumed the person officiating my vows was a local reverend or a generic hired celebrant. She expected that individual to flounder awkwardly when the family drama unfolded. She budgeted for my tears. She planned for my mother to rush forward and forcefully negotiate a truce. She believed the ceremony would simply pause to accommodate her boundless ego. It never registered in her mind that the man holding the leather-bound ceremonial text possessed the legal authority to sign federal subpoenas. She did not comprehend that stepping onto this specific estate meant submitting to a jurisdiction where her manipulative tactics held zero currency. The hired string musicians had ceased their playing entirely. The crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean provided the only auditory backdrop to the escalating tension on the lawn. 200 prominent guests leaned forward in their white folding chairs. They waited for the traditional opening remarks. They expected Montgomery to request that the assembly join hands or bow their heads in a standard invocation. They anticipated the familiar cadence of a joyous gathering. He offered them nothing. The magistrate stood motionless. He shifted his piercing gaze away from Evan and me. He directed his focus straight down the gravel runner, locking his eyes onto the trembling figure of Isabella. The look Montgomery delivered was devoid of hot anger. Anger implies a loss of emotional control. He projected a profound, clinical contempt. It was the exact expression he utilized when sentencing unrepentant white-collar criminals. He analyzed her ruined, butchered silk. He scrutinized her defensive posture and her panicked, darting eyes. He processed her guilt in real time. Under the weight of his scrutiny, Isabella's remaining arrogance dissolved. Her shoulders hunched inward. The stolen masterpiece she wore ceased to function as a glamorous shield. It transformed into a glowing beacon of her own criminality. The fashion editors in the front rows watched this silent exchange, recognizing the severity of the situation. High society thrives on subtle cues. A federal judge glaring at a wedding guest is not a subtle cue. It is a swift execution order. Montgomery raised his hands slowly. He held a thick ceremonial book embossed with gold lettering. He did not open the pages. Instead, he gripped the edges and brought the covers together. The heavy leather-bound volume closed with a sharp, definitive snap. That single noise echoed across the manicured grass, acting like a physical blow. It signaled the official termination of the expected social contract. The romantic facade of the afternoon shattered. The floral arrangements and the scenic ocean views melted away, leaving behind the cold, sterile atmosphere of a tribunal. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It pressed down on the attendees, pinning them to their seats. The magistrate inhaled deeply, preparing to deliver his verdict. His voice possessed a rich, booming baritone quality that carried effortlessly over the coastal winds. He did not require a microphone to reach the paparazzi stationed beyond the wrought iron gates. "I am a sworn officer of the federal court," Montgomery announced. His words sliced through the dense air with surgical precision. The guests stiffened. A few of the hedge fund managers who routinely navigated precarious legal boundaries physically recoiled. "And I will not officiate a sacred ceremony that is actively harboring a felony." The declaration struck the lawn like a lightning bolt. Isabella gasped audibly. Her manicured hands flew to her mouth, trying to catch the terrified noise escaping her throat. She shifted her weight uneasily, her stilettos grinding against the stones. She looked frantically toward the first row, searching for her mother. Evelyn remained cemented to her chair, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public indictment. There was no maternal rescue coming. My mother finally understood that she could not manipulate a federal officer. She could not deploy a gentle tone to excuse grand larceny. Isabella's mind raced, attempting to process the catastrophic shift in her reality. She had dressed for a social triumph. She was now standing in the crosshairs of the justice system. The word felony hung over her head, refusing to dissipate. She realized the elite crowd was no longer whispering about her poor fashion choices. They were witnessing her legal ruin. The high-definition camera lenses pointed at her from the perimeter were not capturing a bold fashion statement. They were documenting undeniable evidence. She tried to take a step backward, but her knees buckled slightly under the terror of the moment. She was trapped on the gravel runway, a prisoner of her own design. The paparazzi stationed outside the wrought iron gates suddenly stopped their frantic shouting. The freelance photographers lowered their cameras for a brief second, processing the legal terminology echoing from the altar. They quickly realized this footage would sell for unprecedented sums. A federal judge halting a high society wedding due to a felony was a headline that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. They adjusted their telephoto lenses, focusing tightly on Isabella's panicked expression. They documented the exact second the color drained from her face. Princess Elena remained seated in the third row, maintaining her rigid, elegant posture. She offered a slight approving nod toward the altar. The European aristocrat appreciated the severe, swift application of justice. She had traveled across an ocean to confront the thief who butchered her commissioned artwork. Seeing the American judicial system validate her grievance provided a deep sense of aristocratic satisfaction. She watched Isabella squirm on the gravel, feeling zero sympathy for the ruined woman. I stood next to Evan, absorbing the profound shift in the atmosphere. The heavy architectural folds of my platinum gown caught the coastal breeze brushing softly against the wooden steps of the altar. I felt an incredible sense of lightness in my chest. The suffocating burden I had carried since childhood was finally lifting. I did not have to protect my sister from the consequences of her actions anymore. I did not have to absorb her collateral damage to keep the peace. The state was taking over that responsibility. I watched the terror bloom in Isabella's eyes, and I felt nothing but the calm resolution of an auditor closing a fraudulent account. Evan squeezed my hand, grounding me in the present moment. He stood tall beside me, radiating a quiet, protective strength. He watched the woman who had tormented me for 2 decades finally face an immovable boundary. He did not pity my sister. He respected the meticulous snare we had engineered. The generational wealth seated on his side of the aisle nodded in silent approval. They appreciated the ruthless efficiency of our response. In their world, an attack on a family asset required a disproportionate retaliation to ensure it never happened again. Justice Montgomery did not elaborate. He did not offer a sermon on morality or lecture my sister on her ethical failures. He had delivered his assessment and established the parameters of the space. The wedding was halted. The jurisdiction was transferred. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating from the center of the floral archway. He folded his hands in front of his dark robes, projecting an aura of stoic observation. By stepping aside, he yielded the floor. He cleared the stage, allowing the true architect of Isabella's impending ruin to step into the light. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see who would step into the vacuum of power. In the front row, Victoria picked up her thick legal folder. She uncrossed her legs and smoothed the front of her tailored charcoal blazer. The corporate strike was ready to commence. The vacuum of power on the manicured lawn lasted for exactly 3 seconds. From the front row on the bride's side, Victoria rose to her feet. She did not rush. She smoothed the front of her tailored charcoal blazer with calm precision. In a social ecosystem where women wore pastel chiffon and delicate floral silks, my attorney resembled an apex predator navigating a garden party. She clutched a thick manila folder in her left hand. The paper contained every ounce of digital evidence we had gathered over the past 14 days. Victoria stepped into the center of the white gravel aisle, placing herself directly between my older sibling and the floral altar. "Isabella Winston," my attorney announced. Her voice carried no heat. It was entirely clinical. The tone amplified the severity of the quiet atmosphere gripping the coastal estate. It was the exact voice Victoria utilized when dismantling corporate espionage rings in downtown courtrooms. She did not view my sister as a family member experiencing a lapse in judgment. She treated her as a hostile entity actively committing intellectual property theft. My sister flinched visibly. Hearing her full name spoken with such sterile authority stripped away the very last layer of her vanity. She stared at the woman in the charcoal suit, unable to comprehend how the dynamic had shifted so rapidly. Isabella spent her entire existence manipulating emotional responses. She knew how to weaponize tears and deploy strategic apologies to bend relatives to her will. You cannot emotionally manipulate a legal dossier. You cannot charm a recorded state statute. Victoria opened the thick folder. She did not read from the pages because she had memorized the timeline flawlessly. She simply let the visible stack of documents serve as a physical manifestation of our preparation. "The garment you are currently wearing contains a registered tracking device," she stated. The words floated over the audience, hitting the front rows with lethal accuracy. "We have the digital logs proving you transported this stolen corporate asset to an unauthorized tailor in an outer borough." A sharp gasp escaped Isabella's throat. Her hands flew to the bodice of the crushed silk. Her fingers clawed frantically at the fabric just above her ribs as if the material had suddenly caught fire. She searched the intricate beadwork, looking for the hidden transmitter that had plotted her downfall. The realization hit her with staggering force. The dress she believed would guarantee her social triumph had been broadcasting her guilt 24 hours a day. She had draped herself in her own indictment. The fashion editors, seated mere feet away, leaned forward in their folding chairs. The narrative was unfolding better than any exclusive interview they could have arranged. A premier designer embedding security technology into a bespoke masterpiece to catch a thief was a story that would define the bridal industry for years. The hedge fund managers nodded in quiet respect. They appreciated the flawless execution of a corporate countermeasure. They understood the harsh necessity of protecting high-value assets from internal threats. Victoria let the revelation settle over the crowd before delivering the next strategic blow. Its unauthorized display today, combined with the structural damage you inflicted, constitutes grand larceny under state law. She clarified the specific legal threshold so the entire audience could hear. You did not just borrow a dress, you stole and subsequently destroyed a registered asset valued at $150,000. Isabella shook her head side to side in a frantic, silent denial. Her carefully styled hair began to unravel, slipping from its expensive pins. She looked toward our mother, pleading for an immediate intervention. She wanted Evelyn to explain that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She needed someone to translate this harsh legal reality back into a manageable family squabble. Evelyn remained frozen in her seat. The matriarch, who had spent 3 decades shielding her favored child from consequence, found herself pinned down by the sheer weight of the federal and civil statutes hovering over the lawn. Evelyn realized that defending her daughter right now meant legally tying herself to a 6-figure crime. Self-preservation finally outweighed maternal favoritism. When Isabella saw her mother refuse to stand, the isolation became total. The illusion of her untouchable beauty shattered into dust. She possessed no leverage. Her aesthetic appeal held zero currency against a documented felony. For the first time in 27 years, she was facing an opponent who did not care how stunning she looked in the afternoon light. Victoria was not finished. A successful corporate strike requires forcing the target into an immediate corner with 0 favorable exits. My attorney raised her right hand and gestured sharply toward the back of the coastal property. The heavy wrought iron gates separating the estate from the public road swung inward. The movement drew the attention of the entire assembly. 2 uniformed local police officers stepped through the opening. Their dark uniforms stood in stark contrast to the pastel colors of the wedding guests. The crackle of their shoulder-mounted radios cut through the quiet ocean breeze. They did not run. They walked with steady, measured strides up the paved driveway, stopping just at the edge of the manicured grass. They rested their hands near their utility belts, projecting calm but undeniable authority. The appearance of law enforcement at an ultra-exclusive Hamptons event sent a final shockwave through the audience. The guests understood that the parameters of the afternoon had permanently shifted. This was no longer a private dispute. The authorities were present and watching. The paparazzi outside the gates pressed their lenses against the metal bars, capturing the officers standing at attention. "You are standing at this altar in stolen evidence." Victoria continued her gaze, locking onto my sister like a physical restraint. "The officers are waiting at the perimeter line. We hold the signed warrant authorizing them to secure the property currently resting on your shoulders." Isabella looked back toward the gates. She saw the glint of the sunlight reflecting off the officers' silver badges. The reality of a physical arrest loomed over her. She imagined the cold metal handcuffs snapping around her wrists. She pictured herself being escorted through the crowd of elite peers, shoved into the back of a squad car while wearing the ruined silk. The social exile she had already suffered would mutate into a permanent criminal record. Her future prospects in New York society would disintegrate. Victoria offered the final ultimatum. Her tone remained steady and devoid of empathy. "I suggest you step down and walk away immediately," she advised. "Leave this venue right now, or those officers will escort you off the property in handcuffs. The choice is yours." The silence that followed the ultimatum possessed a suffocating weight. My sister stood trapped between the floral altar and the police barricade. She looked down at the hem of the butchered silk dragging against the white stones. She realized she had to surrender her prize to avoid a jail cell. The dress that was supposed to make her a legend was about to make her an inmate. She had to strip herself of her unearned glory and march past the very people she had intended to conquer. As Isabella gathered the heavy fabric in her trembling hands, preparing to make her shameful exit, a sudden noise erupted from the front row. The conflict was not concluding. It was merely shifting targets. Evelyn, having finally processed the gravity of the situation, realized she was not an innocent bystander. My mother had authorized the security breach. She had handed over the temporary keycard allowing the theft to occur. The panic in Evelyn's eyes intensified as she understood my corporate attorney was preparing to hand her the invoice for the remaining damages. The eruption of frantic whispering among the seated guests sounded like a sudden windstorm sweeping across the coastal lawn. Up until this exact second, the elite attendees had maintained a strict veneer of polite restraint. The revelation of the hidden tracking device, combined with the arrival of uniformed police officers, obliterated that restraint entirely. The low murmurs rapidly escalated into an audible, chaotic buzz. The hedge fund directors began dissecting the legal exposure. The fashion editors rapidly texted updates to their respective publication desks. The pristine environment of a Hamptons summer wedding morphed into a spectacular theater of ruin. In the front row, Evelyn finally broke. The matriarch who had spent 3 decades meticulously controlling the narrative of our household realized her script was burning to ash. She saw the silver badges of the officers standing near the wrought iron gates. She processed the cold, uncompromising language my attorney used to describe Isabella's actions. Evelyn understood that Victoria was not issuing empty threats. The legal machinery was functioning flawlessly, and it was aiming directly at her favored child. My mother launched out of her folding chair. The sudden movement sent her expensive silk shawl slipping onto the grass. Her face flushed with a desperate, chaotic energy. The refined poise she spent her entire adult life cultivating evaporated. She abandoned all pretense of high society decorum. "This is a terrible misunderstanding," Evelyn shrieked. Her voice cracked, echoing harshly over the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. "Clara, tell them to stop right now. She is your sister. We are family." She lunged toward the white gravel aisle. Her eyes were wide and frantic. She fully intended to close the physical distance between us. She wanted to grab my hands. She wanted to squeeze my fingers and force me into my historically designated role as the submissive younger daughter. For my entire life, she conditioned me to absorb the collateral damage of Isabella's narcissism. She trained me to swallow my own dignity so the family could maintain an illusion of peace. Evelyn operated on the assumption that if she generated enough public pressure, I would inevitably crumble. She expected me to command my attorney to drop the charges simply to avoid embarrassing her in front of her wealthy peers. She expected me to yield. She did not expect Victoria. Victoria did not flinch. My corporate attorney did not yield a single inch of ground. She simply pivoted her stance, planting her polished leather shoes firmly on the white stones. She placed her tailored charcoal frame directly into my mother's path. Victoria established an iron presence, blocking the route to the floral altar. She became an immovable barrier, protecting her client from any further emotional manipulation. "Evelyn, sit down," Victoria said. My attorney kept her tone conversational, but lethal. She refused to raise her voice to match my mother's hysteria. Speaking quietly forced the frantic matriarch to strain to hear the command, thereby reestablishing control of the interaction. Victoria possessed a deep understanding of power dynamics. She knew that whoever screams first is usually the person holding the weakest hand. This is not a family squabble. Victoria continued her gaze, locking onto Evelyn's panicked eyes. This is a corporate felony. My mother opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another tired excuse about sibling rivalry. Victoria cut her off before a single syllable could form. My attorney raised the thick manila folder, tapping the heavy cardstock cover with her index finger. We have the digital security footage of you bypassing the studio alarms, Victoria stated. We pulled the electronic access logs. We have the exact timestamp proving you utilized a temporary vendor pass under false pretenses to facilitate this theft. You did not just watch your daughter steal a dress. You opened the door for her. The words struck Evelyn like a physical blow. The color rapidly drained from her cheeks, leaving her complexion a sickly pale shade. If you interfere with this recovery process in any capacity, Victoria warned, I will have you personally added to the civil suit as a willing accessory. I will file the injunction tomorrow morning. You will be held jointly liable for the $150,000 base value plus all compounding punitive damages. Sit down, Evelyn. My mother froze. Her forward momentum halted, as if she had collided with a pane of reinforced glass. She hit a boundary she could not manipulate, with tears. She could not gaslight a recorded digital entry log. She could not deploy maternal guilt to negotiate her way out of a six-figure financial liability. The law does not care about family dynamics. The law only cares about evidence. And Victoria held a mountain of it in her left hand. Evelyn looked past the charcoal suit. She searched for my face. Her eyes begged for capitulation. She wanted me to throw her a rope. She wanted me to override the attorney and offer the unconditional forgiveness she had demanded from me since childhood. She silently pleaded for the obedient girl who used to cry in the corner while her older sister tore apart her sketchbooks. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. I felt the cool ocean breeze brush against the architectural folds of my platinum gown. My face offered the warmth of a glacier. I did not blink. I did not offer a subtle nod of reassurance. I let the heavy silence stretch between us. I allowed the 200 elite guests to witness my total rejection of her authority. The connection was permanently severed. I owed her nothing. She had priced my sanity and my career as secondary to Isabella's vanity. I was merely finalizing the transaction she initiated the moment she unlocked my studio door. Defeated, trembling, and publicly exposed, my mother slowly backed away. She sank into her white folding chair. The fight completely drained from her posture. She pulled her designer purse onto her lap, gripping the leather straps with white knuckles. She lowered her head, unable to meet the harsh, judging stares of the hedge fund directors and socialites seated around her. Her reign over my life was officially terminated. The matriarchal empire she built on a foundation of toxic favoritism collapsed into dust. With Evelyn neutralized, the protective wall surrounding my sister vanished. Isabella stood alone on the white runner. The police officers waited at the perimeter gates. The European princess watched from the third row. The trap had successfully eliminated the enabler, leaving the primary target with 0 remaining shields. Isabella looked at her mother, sitting silently in the chair. She realized no rescue was coming. She was going to have to face the consequences of her vanity without a chaperone. The sheer isolation of that moment crystallized on the lawn. For decades, my sister operated under the assumption that our mother would serve as an eternal buffer against the real world. Evelyn was the ultimate insurance policy. Watching that policy get canceled with a few sentences from a corporate attorney broke Isabella's spirit. The fashion editors in the second row scribbled furiously in their notebooks. They documented the fall of the Winston women. They recorded the exact posture of a defeated enabler. This was the currency of their industry. They traded in reputations, and they knew they were currently witnessing a bankruptcy of character. Evelyn would never receive another invitation to a charity gala. She would never sit on another planning committee. Her social standing evaporated the moment she failed to defend her own heist. I turned my attention back to my older sibling. Isabella was hyperventilating slightly. Her chest heaved against the tight, restrictive bodice of the crushed silk. The fabric was never designed to accommodate a panicked, irregular breathing pattern. The black market tailor in Queens had forced the seams to secure a tight fit, but fear causes the human body to expand and contract erratically. She gathered the heavy, butchered skirts of the stolen silk in her hands. She had to make a choice. She could wait for the uniformed officers to march down the aisle and place her in handcuffs, or she could attempt to walk away. The reality of her impending retreat set in. She had to turn her back on the altar and retrace her steps past the very audience she had intended to conquer. My sister took a shaky step backward. She needed to exit the estate. She needed to escape the glare of the high-definition camera lenses and the quiet judging eyes of the metropolitan elite. She turned her body away from the floral archway, preparing to begin her humiliating journey down the gravel path. But the hasty, discounted alterations she commissioned possessed a fatal, hidden flaw. The structural integrity of the masterpiece had been fundamentally compromised, and the intense physical stress of her panic was about to expose that failure to the entire world. Isabella stood at the front of the pristine runner. She faced a stark reality. There was no shield left to hide behind. Our mother sat defeated in a folding chair. The corporate attorney held a documented legal dossier. 2 uniformed officers flanked the primary exit. My sister had spent her entire existence manipulating the people around her, using charm and manufactured victimhood as currency. That currency was now worthless. She possessed 0 leverage. She had to leave the estate. She had to walk back down the exact same gravel path she had paraded down minutes prior. She reached down with trembling fingers. She gathered the heavy skirts of the stolen silk, pulling the cascading fabric into her hands. The material weighed heavily against her palms. The sovereign was constructed from layers of premium French organza and structured boning. It was never designed to be bunched up like a cheap laundry bag. The delicate micro-pearls ground against each other, producing a sharp, scraping sound. She took a shallow breath and turned her back on the floral altar. It was the beginning of the longest retreat of her life. The white gravel aisle stretched out before her, resembling a barren desert. 200 guests flanked the runner. These individuals dictated the aesthetic and financial rhythms of the city. During her initial entrance, Isabella viewed these people as a captive audience meant to validate her beauty. Now they functioned as a silent, ruthless jury. She took her first step away from the front row. Her stiletto heel dug into the stones. In her past, my sister loved an exit just as much as an entrance. She historically used dramatic departures to control the emotional temperature of a room. If a conversation did not center on her achievements, she would storm out, expecting people to chase her. No one was chasing her today. No one reached out a comforting hand. The elite crowd recoiled as she passed. The generational wealth seated on the groom's side pulled their tailored suit jackets tighter. They physically distanced themselves from the walking scandal. Isabella kept her eyes locked on the wrought iron gates at the far end of the property. She needed to reach the public road. She needed to escape the suffocating judgment of the venue. Her breathing grew shallow and frantic. Panic is a physical state. It alters the rhythm of a human stride. She stopped walking with the measured, graceful pace of a society guest. She began to rush. Her steps lengthened. Her posture pitched forward. She was fleeing. This hurried, panicked movement placed an immense, uncalculated strain on the stolen garment. The clandestine tailor in Queens had executed a hasty job. They had taken heavy industrial shears to the bodice, altering the structural foundation to accommodate a shorter frame. They used synthetic discount thread to fuse the new seams together. Synthetic thread possesses a very different tensile strength compared to the natural fibers of European silk. When you place uneven kinetic stress on a compromised foundation, the weakest point will inevitably surrender. Isabella took a wide, hurried step, attempting to clear the third row, where the royal clients sat watching. Princess Elena did not blink. The European aristocrat observed the thief attempting to scurry away. As Isabella's right leg extended forward, her knee pushed hard against the restrictive, altered waistline. The heavy weight of the 10,000 hand-sewn pearls pulled downward against the bodice. The mechanical failure was instantaneous. A loud, unmistakable rip echoed across the quiet coastal lawn. It was the distinct sound of cheap thread giving way under pressure. The rushed seam running along the left side of the ribcage snapped. The structural boning meant to hold the garment flush against the torso sprang outward. The sudden release of tension caused the heavy, crushed silk to drop. The cascading train, which Isabella had been desperately clutching, slipped through her sweaty fingers. The fabric plummeted toward the ground, pooling instantly around her ankles in a chaotic tangle of expensive organza and loose pearls. My sister lost her forward momentum. Her left stiletto caught in the dense layers of the fallen hem. The heel pierced the delicate French silk, pinning her foot to the gravel runner. She tried to catch her balance, but her center of gravity was already compromised. She pitched forward. Her arms flailed outward in a desperate attempt to break her descent. She did not land on the gravel. Her momentum carried her just off the runner. She stumbled and fell hard onto the manicured green grass. She landed squarely in front of the final row of seating. This positioned her mere feet away from the wrought iron perimeter gates. She had landed directly inside the paparazzi pit. The freelance photographers and society columnists stationed outside the bars recognized the gift they had just been handed. A high-profile thief wearing a butchered, stolen masterpiece, tripping and eating dirt at the wedding of the season. It was the defining image of a spectacular downfall. The camera shutters fired in a deafening, rapid symphony. Bright white flashes strobed relentlessly. They documented the exact posture of her humiliation. They captured the ruined bodice, the exposed structural boning, and the sheer panic contorting her features. The press corps immortalized her fall from grace in high-definition, raw digital files. Isabella gasped for air. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her perfectly styled hair hung in her face. Smudged makeup stained her cheeks. She looked up, hoping to find a sliver of pity. Her eyes met the gaze of the premier fashion editors seated in the back rows. These editors were the gatekeepers of her desired world. They controlled the party invitations and the magazine features. They dictated who mattered and who faded into obscurity. They did not offer a hand to help her stand. They did not utter a single word of comfort. In perfect, terrifying unison, the editors physically turned their shoulders away from her. They pivoted their bodies toward the center aisle, deliberately breaking eye contact. It was a physical manifestation of her permanent exile. In New York society, you are not banished with a formal letter. You are banished by becoming invisible to the people who hold the power. By turning their backs, the editors erased her. She was no longer a person of interest. She was a cautionary tale. My sister scrambled to her feet. Her hands shook involuntarily as she grabbed the torn edges of the bodice, holding the ruined silk against her chest to maintain a shred of modesty. She kicked off her tangled stilettos, abandoning the expensive shoes on the grass. She walked the final few yards barefoot. The pristine image she had curated for 27 years was reduced to a barefoot, frantic scramble. She reached the wrought iron gates. The two uniformed police officers stood aside. They had their orders. The corporate directive was clear. She was allowed to leave the premises to avoid a physical altercation on the pristine lawn. We did not need to arrest her at the venue. We already held the evidence required to summon her to a deposition the following morning. The officers simply watched her pass. Their presence guaranteed she would not return. Isabella slipped through the heavy metal bars. She stepped onto the public asphalt. She was not just leaving a summer wedding. She was walking out of elite circles forever. She was wearing a ruined, stolen dress that would now cost her every penny she possessed. Her vanity had triggered a financial and social apocalypse. The event coordinator stepped forward from the shadows of the estate house. The staff member reached out and grabbed the brass handles of the perimeter gates. With a smooth, practiced motion, the coordinator pulled the heavy iron doors shut. The metal latch clicked into place with a definitive, metallic thud. The physical barrier between my sister and my future was officially locked. A profound, clean silence returned to the coastal property. The toxic element was excised. The air felt lighter. The 200 guests collectively exhaled, releasing the tension that had gripped the venue for the past half hour. The runway was clear. The thief was gone. The audience slowly turned their attention back toward the floral archway where I stood, waiting next to Evan. The justice holding his leather-bound book stepped forward. The stage was finally clean. The performance of the impostor was over, but the actual ceremony still required completion. The true vows were waiting to be spoken. And in the background, my corporate attorney was already preparing to hand my mother the final, devastating invoice. The heavy metal gates clicking shut acted as a physical punctuation mark. The toxic element was excised from the pristine coastal lawn. A profound, clean silence returned to the property. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a pending disaster. It was the clear, resonant stillness that follows a violent storm. The 200 elite guests exhaled collectively, letting the residual adrenaline dissipate into the salty ocean breeze. They turned their attention back toward the floral archway, where Evan and I stood waiting. Just as Harold Montgomery shifted his posture, he transitioned flawlessly from a federal magistrate executing an indictment back into a trusted family friend presiding over a sacred union. He opened his heavy leather-bound ceremonial book. His features softened, relaxing the rigid granite mask he had worn during my sister's interrogation. He looked at Evan and then directed his warm gaze toward me. "Now," he said, his voice softening into a rich, comforting baritone, "let us begin." The pivot was a masterclass in composure. The ceremony resumed with a renewed, focused energy. The vows Evan and I exchanged did not feel overshadowed by the preceding scandal. Instead, they felt illuminated by the events that had just transpired. Traditional wedding promises often rely on flowery, generic poetry about eternal devotion. We bypassed the standard romantic platitudes. We spoke about building a fortified partnership. We exchanged promises grounded in fierce loyalty and the mutual defense of our shared future. Evan held both of my hands. He looked directly into my eyes, acknowledging the surgical removal of my past. He promised to stand beside me in every boardroom and every battle. He vowed to protect our household from any external threat, regardless of whether that threat shared my DNA. He recognized the immense emotional labor required to sever a toxic family bond. His words validated my strength. When my turn arrived, my voice remained steady and clear. I promised to honor our alliance above all prior obligations. I vowed to bring only truth and stability into our home. The guests listening from the folding chairs understood the heavy gravity behind every syllable. They recognized that my promises were backed by undeniable action. I had just demonstrated the absolute boundaries I possessed to protect my chosen family. I proved that I would dismantle my own bloodline before I allowed anyone to introduce chaos into my marriage. Montgomery smiled, reading the final blessing from his leather book. He pronounced us husband and wife. Evan leaned forward and kissed me. It was a grounded, deliberate seal of our new reality. When we turned to face the audience, the reaction was unprecedented. High society crowds generally offer polite, restrained golf claps during wedding ceremonies. They prefer to maintain a cool, detached demeanor. Today, they abandoned that protocol. The guests erupted into roaring, genuine applause. Several prominent hedge fund directors actually stood to their feet. The fashion editors clapped with unvarnished enthusiasm. They were not merely celebrating a romantic union. They were paying respect to the sheer surgical strength they had just witnessed. They honored a woman who refused to be victimized on her own stage. We walked back up the white gravel aisle together. The platinum fabric of my architectural gown caught the late afternoon sun, radiating a brilliant metallic glow. The heavy burden of my childhood was gone. The transition from the ceremony to the reception felt seamless. The evening festivities took place inside a breathtaking glass-walled conservatory situated on the western edge of the estate. The transparent structure offered panoramic views of the ocean sunset. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the curated floral centerpieces. Waitstaff circulated through the room carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and gourmet appetizers. The atmosphere was electric. The earlier drama served as an invigorating conversational catalyst. The attendees mingled freely, dissecting the flawless execution of the corporate trap. They praised the integration of the tracking technology and admired the cold efficiency of my legal counsel. I moved through the room with Evan by my side, receiving congratulations from the most influential figures in the metropolitan area. My brand dominance was permanently secured. While the rest of the conservatory buzzed with joyous celebration, a severe contrast existed near the back of the room. My mother sat entirely isolated at a small peripheral table. She had managed to enter the reception hall, but her presence was merely a physical technicality. The social quarantine enacted around her was absolute. No one offered her a glass of wine. No one asked her to dance. The attendees treated her table like a contaminated zone. If an individual accidentally made eye contact with Evelyn, they immediately looked away and walked in the opposite direction. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a party she no longer belonged to. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring blankly at the untouched porcelain dinner plate in front of her. The realization of her new social standing weighed heavily on her shoulders. For decades, she had thrived on networking and manipulating the hierarchy of elite circles. Now, she was the ultimate pariah. She was the mother who enabled the theft of her own daughter's wedding dress. That was a stain that no amount of charity donations or forced smiles could ever wash away. After 2 hours of enduring the suffocating, silent judgment, Evelyn decided she could no longer tolerate the isolation. The jazz band began playing an upbeat tempo, drawing the majority of the guests toward the central dance floor. My mother viewed this distraction as her opportunity to flee. She gathered her designer purse and draped her silk shawl over her shoulders. She stood up, pushing her chair back as quietly as possible. She kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of the passing waiters. She aimed for a discreet side door located near the catering preparation area, hoping to slip out into the night unnoticed. She reached for the brass handle of the exit. Before her fingers could make contact, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a tall, potted fern. Victoria materialized with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator. My corporate attorney did not hold a champagne flute. She did not wear a festive smile. She maintained her pristine, tailored charcoal suit, projecting the austere reality of a boardroom negotiation. Evelyn gasped, taking a frightened step backward. She looked at Victoria with wide, panicked eyes. My mother expected a final scolding or perhaps a demand for a written apology. She still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the transaction she had initiated. Victoria did not deal in emotional reprimands. She dealt exclusively in financial consequences. Victoria reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. She retrieved a sleek, cream-colored envelope. The stationery was thick and expensive, featuring the embossed logo of her prestigious law firm. She extended her arm, holding the document out toward my mother. Evelyn hesitated. Her hands trembled as she stared at the heavy cardstock. She knew taking the envelope meant accepting the reality of her choices. Victoria did not withdraw her hand. She waited with infinite patience, projecting an aura of inescapable authority. Reluctantly, Evelyn reached out and took the envelope. "The invoice for the ruined dress, Victoria," stated smoothly. Her voice carried no malice. It was merely the delivery of a factual statement. "The retail value of the bespoke garment is $150,000. The item is now classified as a destroyed asset. It cannot be sold or salvaged. The financial liability rests entirely on the individuals who facilitated the unauthorized removal from the secure facility." Evelyn opened the flap of the envelope. She pulled out the single sheet of thick paper. Her eyes scanned the printed numbers. The zeros seemed to blur together under the dim lighting of the exit corridor. She swayed slightly on her feet. Victoria delivered the final binding terms of the agreement. "Payment is due in full within 30 days. We do not accept installment plans. If the balance is not settled by the close of business on the 30th day, my firm will initiate the collections process. We already hold the necessary documentation to place a direct lien on your primary residence." Evelyn stared at the invoice. The paper felt heavier than lead. The breath caught in her throat. She looked up at the corporate attorney, desperately searching for a hint of bluffing or a sliver of negotiable leeway. She found zero mercy. Victoria offered a polite clinical nod, stepped aside, and allowed my mother to open the door. Evelyn walked out into the cool, dark coastal night, clutching the document that finalized her ruin. She finally realized her harmless maternal enablement was going to bankrupt her. She had traded her home and her financial security to fund a vanity project that lasted less than 5 minutes. 6 months after the iron gates of the coastal estate clicked shut, the winter winds swept through the avenues of Manhattan. The frigid air carried a sharp, clarifying chill that perfectly mirrored the new architecture of my life. The high society wedding season was a distant memory, replaced by the relentless, structured rhythm of the upcoming bridal fashion week. Inside my secure atelier, the atmosphere hummed with focused, uninterrupted productivity. The dark, heavy shadow that used to loom over my drafting tables was permanently eradicated. I no longer spent my mornings calculating how to shield my inventory from my own relatives. I operated my company with a profound, unburdened clarity. The aftermath of the summer scandal generated an unprecedented wave of industry attention. The prestigious fashion publications did not run a single photograph of the ruined, stolen silk. Instead, the editors dedicated exclusive multi-page editorial spreads to my icy platinum wedding gown. They praised the severe, asymmetrical lines and the unapologetic authority of the design. The exposure cemented my brand at the highest tier of the bridal market. My appointment calendar filled up 3 years in advance. Elite clients flew in from international capitals demanding the same level of architectural precision they witnessed on the white gravel runner. By the end of the 4th fiscal quarter, my corporate revenue had tripled. The financial growth occurred effortlessly because my profit margins were finally untethered from the constant draining demands of my family. While my professional empire expanded, the individuals who attempted to dismantle it experienced a systemic collapse. Isabella discovered that the digital era possesses a terrifying, flawless memory. The high-definition photographs capturing her frantic, barefoot scramble across the manicured grass went viral within hours of the ceremony. The ruthless gossip columnists dissected every flawed synthetic seam of her black market alterations. They mocked her vanity with clinical precision, turning her intended triumph into a permanent cultural punchline. The sheer volume of public humiliation proved fatal to her fragile ego. For a woman who equated her personal worth with her social media metrics, the online mockery functioned as a lethal poison. Isabella was forced to delete every single one of her digital profiles. She erased her curated aesthetic existence to escape the relentless barrage of negative commentary. Stripped of her digital validation and facing a mountain of compounding legal debt, she could no longer afford the cost of living on the Upper East Side. She quietly packed her remaining possessions and fled the state. Through my legal counsel, I received periodic updates regarding her new reality. She relocated to a quiet Midwestern suburb where the local population did not care about haute couture or Hamptons etiquette. The civil lawsuit finalized the distribution of her financial penalties. Because she lacked liquid assets, a judge ordered the garnishment of her future wages. My sister, who spent her youth mocking the concept of manual labor, was forced to secure entry-level retail employment just to meet her monthly legal obligations. She spends her days folding inexpensive synthetic garments under fluorescent lights, handing over a significant percentage of her meager paycheck to satisfy the debt she owes my corporation. Her vanity engineered her own lifelong servitude. The fallout from my mother arrived with the same ruthless efficiency. The cream-colored envelope Victoria handed her outside the glass conservatory contained a rigid 30-day deadline. Evelyn assumed she could utilize her remaining social connections to secure a short-term loan or negotiate a settlement. She discovered that high society views a public scandal as a highly contagious disease. When she reached out to her wealthy peers for assistance, her phone calls went straight to voicemail. The prominent socialites and charity board directors revoked her invitations to their galas and luncheons. Her name was quietly but efficiently scrubbed from every exclusive guest list in the metropolitan area. Evelyn failed to produce the required $150,000 by the close of business on the 30th day. Victoria kept her promise. My attorney filed the necessary paperwork the following morning, placing a direct legal lien on the family property. The encumbrance forced a rapid liquidation. Evelyn had to list her spacious home at a severe discount to satisfy the outstanding corporate invoice. She packed away her designer handbags and her vintage jewelry, moving into a cramped, modest apartment far away from the elite neighborhoods she used to dominate. She lives in deep isolation. The matriarch who once thrived on manipulating the dynamics of a crowded room now spends her evenings alone. She traded her prestige and her comfort to fund a 5-minute runway walk that ended in disaster. The invisible empire she built upon a foundation of toxic favoritism crumbled under the weight of a single documented ledger. I did not revel in their misery. I simply stopped paying attention to it. The energy I used to spend surviving their toxicity was reallocated toward building my own sanctuary. On a cold Friday evening in December, I sat inside a vibrant, dimly lit restaurant in the heart of the city. The space was loud and chaotic in the best possible way. The air smelled of roasted garlic and rich red wine. The dining table was a sprawling expanse of scarred reclaimed wood, covered in shared plates and half-empty water glasses. There were no curated seating charts enforcing a strict social hierarchy. There was no underlying resentment humming beneath the conversation. No one at this table monitored my posture or demanded that I shrink my personality to make them feel more comfortable. Evan sat close to my left side, his arm draped casually across the back of my wooden chair. He was laughing deeply at a story being told across the table. His presence remained a steady, grounding anchor. Victoria sat directly across from me. She wore a thick, comfortable cashmere sweater, having shed her intimidating charcoal courtroom armor for the weekend. She held a slice of toasted bread, gesturing enthusiastically while debating the merits of a recent documentary with our closest friends. I leaned back in my chair and simply observed the people surrounding me. These individuals did not view me as a resource to be harvested. They did not measure my value by the amount of collateral damage I was willing to absorb. They asked nothing of me except my genuine presence. They rejoiced in my triumphs and offered fierce protection during my trials. I reached forward and picked up my glass of Cabernet. The deep red liquid caught the warm amber light of the restaurant candles. A toxic family system relies on your continued silence to maintain their illusion of control. They depend on your willingness to prioritize their comfort over your own sanity. They expect you to bury the evidence of their cruelty to preserve a fragile, manufactured peace. The moment you refuse to play your designated role, the dynamic fractures. The moment you introduce a factual ledger to their continuous lies, their empire collapses. I spent 27 years trying to earn a place at a table that was actively charging me rent. I paid for my seat with my self-esteem, my professional boundaries, and my emotional stability. I finally realized that any relationship requiring you to purchase your own dignity is a bad investment. I raised my glass, offering a silent toast to the sharp winter night. I had lost the family that priced me by the yard and weighed my worth in stolen silk, but I had gained the family that saved me a seat without requiring a deposit. The ledger was balanced, the accounts were closed, and I knew with pristine clarity that I would never pay for my place again. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a lifelong illusion finally shatters. It is not peaceful. It is the heavy, suffocating quiet of a consequence arriving years past its due date. When we look at the ruins of the Winston family, a mother sitting isolated at a wedding reception, a favored daughter fleeing in a destroyed silk gown, and a younger sibling forced to act as an executioner to save her own life, it is easy to focus on the spectacular nature of the theft. We are drawn to the drama of the stolen dress, the hidden tracking device, and the federal judge. But the true tragedy of this story did not begin with a stolen keycard in a Manhattan atelier. It began decades earlier, in the quiet, everyday moments of a traditional American home, where a mother decided that loving a child meant shielding her from the word no. In modern American culture, we place a massive premium on the concept of family devotion. We are taught that a parent's ultimate responsibility is to protect their young, to pave a smooth road for them to walk on, and to champion their self-esteem above all else. But there is a dangerous, unseen edge to this philosophy when it is stripped of honesty and fairness. Evelyn did not wake up one morning and consciously decide to cultivate a criminal. She likely believed she was simply softening the harsh blows of the world for her eldest daughter. When Isabella broke a rule, Evelyn offered an excuse. When Isabella stole the spotlight, Evelyn applauded the performance. She meticulously curated Isabella's reality, ensuring the girl never had to feel the sting of her own failures. But in doing so, Evelyn committed the most profound betrayal a parent can inflict upon a child. She robbed her of the opportunity to develop a functioning conscience. Raising children within a traditional family structure requires a delicate, relentless emotional awareness. It demands the courage to look at your offspring and recognize their inherent flaws without withdrawing your love. Above all, it requires fairness, the fundamental understanding that no single child's comfort should ever be purchased with another child's dignity. Evelyn failed this metric spectacularly. She transformed her household into a transactional economy. Clara, the younger daughter, was treated not as a person requiring nurture, but as a utility. Her successes, her talents, and her boundaries were routinely harvested to fund Isabella's fragile vanity. When parents establish this kind of dynamic, they are not building a family, they are building a hierarchy. And hierarchies are inherently unstable because they rely entirely on the continued, silent submission of the exploited. The long-term guidance of a child is not about ensuring they always win. It is about equipping them with the emotional fortitude to handle losing gracefully. It is about teaching them that their desires do not supersede the rights of the people around them. Evelyn shielded Isabella from the small, necessary corrections of childhood. She protected her from the minor embarrassments of sharing, from the sting of a poor grade, and from the productive guilt of a broken toy. By systematically removing these small, manageable consequences, Evelyn guaranteed that when the real world finally corrected her daughter, the correction would be catastrophic. If you refuse to teach your child the boundaries of human decency in the privacy of your own living room, society will eventually teach them those boundaries in a public courtroom. We often romanticize the idea of unconditional love, mistakenly believing that love means a lack of conditions on behavior. But true, profound parental love is incredibly heavy. It is the willingness to be the villain in your child's story for an afternoon so that they do not become the villain in someone else's story for a lifetime. Evelyn lacked this specific courage. Her enablement was not a product of overwhelming affection. It was a product of overwhelming cowardice. She was too afraid of Isabella's tantrums to actually parent her. She was too afraid of disrupting the flawless aesthetic of her Hamptons lifestyle to acknowledge the deep structural rot festering in her own foundation. Many of us have sat at dining tables where the air was thick with similar unspoken resentments. We have watched a parent bend the rules for a sibling who demands everything while expecting the quiet, responsible child to silently absorb the friction to maintain the status quo. We have been told to be the bigger person, to keep the peace, and to let it go, because they are family. This story serves as a stark, glaring mirror held up to those domestic compromises. It asks us to examine the heavy cost of our silence. When we tolerate emotional extortion in the name of familial loyalty, we are not keeping the peace. We are merely delaying an inevitable war. If you have ever felt the agonizing weight of being the responsible one in a family that only values your utility, you are not alone in the dark. There is immense power in recognizing the rigid patterns of toxic enablement, and there is profound freedom in deciding to step off the stage of someone else's manufactured drama. Welcome to Cherry Vengeance Stories, a community where we dissect the quiet realities of family boundaries, the dignity of walking away, and the sweet justice of a well-balanced ledger. If Clara's journey resonated with the unspoken truths of your own life, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and please ensure you subscribe to join us for more narratives that validate your strength and your boundaries. As we look back at the shattered illusion of the Winston family, we are left to grapple with an uncomfortable truth about the nature of our closest human bonds. Society fiercely dictates that family is our ultimate sanctuary, a sacred, unbreakable covenant that must be preserved at all costs. We are relentlessly told that blood is thicker than water, a phrase weaponized to imply that shared DNA mandates a lifetime of unconditional access to our hearts, our patience, and our resources. But perhaps conventional wisdom is entirely backward. Perhaps blood does not grant someone an irrevocable lease on your life. A biological connection is merely a starting point, a random introduction assigned by the lottery of birth. True family is not defined by who was standing in the hospital room when you took your first breath. It is defined by who is willing to stand beside you when the truth is ugly and the consequences are intensely real. The greatest failure of a parent is not raising a child who struggles, bleeds, and occasionally falls short of the world's expectations. The absolute, unforgivable failure is raising a child who believes their bloodline exempts them from the basic human requirement to be good. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is looking at the people who gave you life, realizing they cannot give you peace, and quietly, permanently closing the door.